Imagine a room where time has entirely stopped. It is late. The world outside your window has finally gone quiet. The heavy, restless machinery of the modern day has powered down, leaving only the stillness of the night. You're standing in the deep, temperature-controlled basement of a museum archive. The lights are dim, casting long, soft shadows across rows of steel cabinets. The air here is cool and perfectly still. It smells faintly of dry dust, old paper, and something else. Something mineral. Something profoundly ancient. You are completely alone, surrounded by the quiet remnants of forgotten worlds. Before you, resting delicately on a bed of dark charcoal foam, is a small object. It is no larger than the palm of your hand. If you were to reach out and pick it up, you would immediately feel the dense, cold weight of river clay. This is a tablet from the ancient Near East. It was pulled from the unforgiving sands of Mesopotamia, baked by the sun and buried in the dark for millennia. As you settle into the quiet of this space, let your breathing slow down. Allow the lingering noise of your day to fade away. If you find peace in these late-night journeys into the deep past, consider leaving a gentle like on this video. Leave a comment below sharing where you're drifting off to sleep from tonight. And please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring these quiet archives together. Your quiet presence here makes this journey possible. Now let us return to the object in your hand. Look closely at the clay. Across the surface of this small, hardened block of earth, there are tiny, precise, wedge-shaped marks. Cuneiform, the script of the Sumerians. These are some of the very first written words in the history of humanity. But right now, the translation of these words is not what draws your eye. Look at the bottom left corner of the tablet. Just below the final meticulously carved line of text, there is an indentation. It is not a symbol. It is not a word. It is a mistake. Or perhaps it is an accidental signature. It is a thumbprint. It is the physical, undeniable impression of a human hand, pressed deep into the wet mud over 4,000 years ago. If you look closely, you can still see the microscopic ridges of the skin. You can see the slight, uneven smear where the scribe applied just a little too much pressure before pulling their hand away. For a moment, as you stare at those ridges, the vast, terrifying gulf of history simply collapses. The thousands of years separating you from that ancient writer vanish into the quiet night air. You're no longer looking at a sterile mythological artifact behind museum glass. You're looking at a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. You're looking at a tired worker sitting by the muddy banks of the Euphrates River, trying to finish their daily ledger before the sun goes down. This single, fragile thumbprint grounds us in a profound reality. It reminds us that the people of ancient Sumer were not abstract characters in a fairy tale. They were flesh and blood. They felt the heavy heat of the Mesopotamian sun. They felt the ache of a long day of labour. And they felt the cool, welcoming relief of the evening wind. They were just like us. And yet, they built the very first great cities of our world. Out of the raw, untamed earth, they mapped the complex movements of the stars. They codified intricate laws, engineered massive irrigation networks, and raised colossal ziggurats toward the heavens. But as we hold this piece of baked earth, a quiet, unsettling question begins to surface in the dark. Mainstream history tells us that this scribe and the civilization they belonged to were the very first of their kind. We are taught that humanity slowly, clumsily dragged itself out of the Stone Age, inventing complex civilization from absolute scratch. But something about that explanation remains incomplete. When you look deeply at the sudden, staggering achievements of Sumer, they do not look like the messy, trial-and-error experiments of a young species just learning how to build. They do not look like a beginning. As you drift closer to sleep, hold the intimate image of that thumbprint in your mind. We are about to step back into the deep, dark waters of time. We are going to ask what really happened at the dawn of human memory, and whether the story we've been told about our origins is missing its most crucial chapter. If you look closely at the clay tablet, you can trace the ridges of that single, ancient thumbprint. Let your mind follow those microscopic lines outward, past the edges of the hardened earth, past the glass display cases of the quiet museum, and out into the absolute dark of the ancient world. Think about what it means to cross thousands of years. We measure our own lives in mere decades. A century feels like a monumental epoch, but here we're attempting to look across a vast, silent ocean of time. 5,000 years. This is deep time. It is a scale that our waking minds are simply not built to hold. In deep time, the world as we know it dissolves. Entire empires rise, carve their names into stone, and collapse back into the soil, leaving nothing but scattered dust and the howling of the wind. Even the earth itself forgets. Mountains erode. Rivers slowly change their course. The mighty Euphrates, which once fed those early bustling cities, has wandered miles from its ancient bed. It left the great ziggurats stranded, turning them into lonely mountains of brick drowning in a sea of dry, unforgiving sand. History, as we are taught it in the bright light of day, feels solid and secure. It is presented to us as a straight, unbroken line, marching confidently out of the primitive darkness and steadily up toward the modern era. But in the quiet hours of the night, this illusion fades. When you stand in the stillness of an archive surrounded by the physical remnants of the Sumerians, you begin to realize that history is not a continuous line at all. It is a shattered mirror. We possess only a handful of the gleaming pieces. Most of human memory has been entirely erased. It has been consumed by fire, washed away by flood, and ground down by the slow, merciless decay of the centuries. What actually survives is nothing short of a miracle of chance. A fragment of baked mud, a broken foundation stone, a quiet whisper trapped in the geometry of cuneiform. We gather these isolated fragments and desperately try to assemble them into a picture that makes sense. We try to force them into a comforting story of slow, clumsy human progress. As you rest there, listening in the dark, let the immense weight of that forgotten past settle over you. Feel the slow rhythm of the centuries passing. If you are finding comfort in this journey into the unknown, I invite you to leave a quiet like or subscribe to the channel. Your presence here, in these late night hours, helps keep these ancient memories breathing. Share your thoughts in the comments if a particular mystery keeps you awake, for we are all wandering these paths together. We naturally assume that if we just dig deep enough into the sands of Mesopotamia, we will eventually find the very beginning. We expect to uncover the primitive stages of human thought, the crude, early attempts at building a society, the trial and the error. This is the fundamental rule of Orthodox history. Everything must start small. Everything must slowly, painfully evolve over thousands of years. But something about that explanation remains deeply incomplete. Because when we look back at the tablet resting in the shadows, the one marked by that singular human touch, it tells an entirely different story. This specific piece of clay, and the precise words carefully pressed into it, does not describe a beginning. Instead, it describes something seemingly impossible. It holds a record that entirely breaks the accepted rules of time. What do we expect to find when we strip away the modern world and dig down to the very beginning of human history? We naturally expect to find the slow, clumsy footsteps of a species just learning how to walk. Our minds are trained to look for a gradual ascent. We expect to see primitive scratches on bone, evolving, painfully and slowly, over tens of thousands of years. We expect trial and we expect a tremendous amount of error. Orthodox history tells us that civilization is a massive grinding wheel. It takes millennia of friction and failure just to gain a fraction of momentum. We look for the developmental debris of early human effort, the collapsed walls of early settlements, the shattered pottery of a people just figuring out how to bake clay. We expect a long rehearsal before the main performance. But as you hold that clay tablet in your mind's eye, feeling the phantom ridges of that ancient thumbprint, a strange, quiet realization begins to settle in the dark space of the archive. This object, and the vast culture that produced it, simply do not fit the timeline. They refuse to obey the comforting rules of a slow crawl out of the prehistoric darkness. When we look closely at the Sumerians, we do not find a rehearsal. We do not find a slow, stumbling progression toward greatness. Instead, we are confronted with a sudden, almost blinding arrival. Around the year 3500 BCE, a fully mature, breathtakingly complex civilization just appears in the historical record. It rises from the mud of the Euphrates River Valley with an uncanny completeness. This is not some sensationalist theory. It is a quiet, profound anomaly recognized by the very scholars who first pulled these cities from the sand, an anomaly that sits right out in the open. Think about the nature of invention. Usually, when a culture learns to build massive structures, we find the ruins of their unstable early attempts. We find the structural failures. But the Sumerians immediately began raising towering ziggurats. These were masterworks of civic engineering, built with advanced baked bricks and a deep pre-existing understanding of mathematics. There is a staggering lack of developmental debris. When a society learns to write, we should find centuries of proto-writing. We should see simple tally marks that slowly morph into complex grammar. But cuneiform arrives in the soil almost entirely complete. It emerges as a sophisticated system of over 700 distinct symbols. From its earliest days, it was capable of recording abstract philosophy, complex legal contracts, and celestial movements. It is as if a child sat down at a piano for the very first time and flawlessly executed a complex symphony. History demands a slow progression, but the Sumerian anomaly bypasses the necessary evolution, and this is where the story becomes more difficult. So, we must ask a delicate question. The kind of question that only truly makes sense when the rest of the world is asleep, when the rigid constraints of ordinary time begin to loosen their grip. What if the beginning of human history is not a beginning at all? What if the sudden perfection of Sumer was not the result of miraculous overnight invention? What if we are not witnessing the dawn of a new civilization, but the organized, desperate preservation of an old one? As we prepare to step further into this ancient shadow, I invite you to make yourself entirely comfortable. Let the heavy demands of your day fall away into the dark. If you are finding peace and curiosity in this quiet journey, I would be deeply grateful if you gently tapped the like button, subscribed to the channel, and shared your thoughts in the comments below. Your presence here, in the quiet hours, is truly appreciated. Now, take a slow, deep breath. Let the silence wrap around you. We are going to drift deeper into this impossible culture, because the closer we look, the more history refuses to make sense. Listen to the quiet of your room for a moment. The day is finally over. The immediate demands of your life, the loud and urgent voices of the modern world have completely faded away. It is just you, the dark, and the soft, steady presence of this narrative. You might be lying in bed right now, staring up at the ceiling, waiting patiently for sleep to arrive. Or perhaps you're simply resting your eyes, seeking a quiet corner of the night where your mind can wander without pressure. Wherever you are, I want you to know that you are completely safe here. There is nothing you need to solve tonight. There is no task left unfinished that cannot wait for the morning sun. You can let go of the tension you are carrying. You can allow your breathing to slow down, to deepen, to match the slow and ancient rhythm of the stories we are uncovering. The night is a sanctuary. It is a quiet space where the rigid rules of the day no longer apply. When the world is asleep, the boundaries of time begin to blur. The walls of your room dissolve into the soft shadows. The distance between you and the ancient world is not nearly as far as it seems in the harsh light of day. When you strip away the noise of the present moment, you're sharing the exact same stillness that an ancient scribe felt. Imagine them for a moment, sitting by the banks of the Euphrates River, watching the stars turn in the deep, velvet sky. They understood this quiet. They understood that the night is a threshold, a place where memory lives and breathes. As you settle deeper into your rest, allow yourself to drift across that threshold. Feel the heavy, comforting weight of deep time settling around you. It is a gentle reminder that our modern worries are so very small. They are mere whispers in a grand story that has been unfolding for thousands upon thousands of years. If you find peace in these midnight journeys, I invite you to leave a small trace of your presence. Just as the ancient scribe pressed their thumb into the wet clay to say they were here, you can gently press the like button. It is a quiet signal in the dark, a way of letting me know that these stories resonate with you. If you wish to wander through these forgotten archives again, consider subscribing to the channel. We will always be here, waiting in the quiet hours, whenever you need to step away from the relentless march of the present. And if a specific thought drifts into your mind as you hover on the edge of sleep, leave it in the comments below. I read them. They become the modern fragments of our own shared record. Your silent participation is what keeps this quiet space alive. But for now, there is absolutely no effort required. You do not even need to keep your eyes open. Let your eyelids grow heavy. Let the sound of my voice become a steady, calm current, a river carrying you away from the rocky shores of today. The beautiful thing about exploring Orthodox history and the anomalies that break it is the profound sense of release it offers. We do not have to carry the weight of the world. We are only visitors here, walking gently through the ruins of empires that have long since returned to dust. Feel the warmth of where you are resting. Notice the rhythm of your breath, in and out. Slow and steady, like the tide of a forgotten sea, like the slow, inevitable turning of the constellations above the ruined ziggurats. You are completely secure, anchored comfortably in the present, even as your mind begins to travel backward into the deep shadows of antiquity. Let the modern world fall away entirely now. We are leaving this room behind. We are travelling back far beyond the boundaries of what we thought we knew, back to 3500 BCE. The air is growing warmer. The scent of dry earth and ancient rivers fills the night. We are walking toward the very edge of human memory, to a place where history suddenly refuses to make sense. The Sumerian anomaly is waiting for us in the sands, and we're going to look very closely at the impossible foundations they left behind. Imagine the physical landscape of ancient Mesopotamia, the wind moving slowly across the flat, sun-baked earth, the Euphrates River, heavy with silt, carving its steady path toward the Persian Gulf. It is the middle of the 4th millennium before our current era, roughly 3500 BCE. According to the orthodox historical timeline we have all been taught, this is an era of quiet, primitive simplicity. Humanity is supposed to be scattered in small, fragile agricultural communities, just beginning to figure out the very basics of survival. But as we drift over the shimmering horizon of the ancient Near East, a shadow falls across the mudflats. It is not a natural formation. It is a monument of staggering, impossible ambition. This is the city of Uruk. Rising suddenly from the wet clay, Uruk is not a village. It is a sprawling, meticulously planned metropolis. Picture a massive defensive wall stretching for 6 unbroken miles, encircling a highly organised urban grid. Within these walls, tens of thousands of people are moving through paved streets, governed by complex laws and participating in a massive, interconnected economy. At the centre of it all, piercing the sky, are the ziggurats. We spoke briefly of these stepped pyramids before, but to stand at their base is to understand their true weight. They are not merely piled earth. They are marvels of precise, monumental engineering, constructed from millions of kiln-fired mud bricks, sealed against the elements with waterproof bitumen, and perfectly aligned with the cardinal directions. As we stand here in the shadows of these ancient giants, I want to gently invite you to find a comfortable position. If this quiet exploration of deep time brings you peace, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment about what ancient mystery fascinates you most, and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to continue these late-night journeys together, wandering through the corridors of forgotten history. Now, let us breathe in the cool night air of Uruk, and look closer at the anomaly before us. To build a city of this scale, a civilization needs more than just muscle. It requires advanced geometry to plan the architecture. It requires sophisticated logistics to feed an urban population of 50,000 souls. It requires a deep understanding of hydrology to dig the intricate networks of canals that surround the city walls. History, as we understand it, loves a slow progression. When archaeologists dig into the ruins of other ancient cultures, they expect to find a clear, logical sequence of development. They look for the clumsy, early attempts, the small mud shrines that slowly over thousands of years evolve into larger temples, the winding, chaotic footpaths that gradually widen into organised roads. They look for the trial and error, the developmental debris, but Uruk skips the rehearsal. It simply steps out of the dark and onto the stage of human history. Fully formed and completely mature, the suddenness of its arrival is one of the most profound mysteries in the archaeological record. When we dig beneath the foundations of Uruk, we do not find the centuries of failed engineering experiments we would logically expect. We do not find the collapsed walls of builders who are still learning how to calculate load-bearing angles. The blueprint of civilization appears to have been executed flawlessly on the very first try. And this is where the orthodox explanation begins to fray. If the Sumerians did not spend thousands of years slowly developing these complex urban sciences, where did the knowledge come from? If there is no trial and error, what exactly are we looking at? To understand how strange the sudden rise of Uruk is, we need to think about how human beings actually learn. We learn by failing. When archaeologists dig down into the ancient earth, they are usually not digging up perfection, they are digging up our mistakes. This is a concept we call developmental debris. It is the beautifully flawed, broken trail of trial and error that marks the true path of human progress. Before any civilization can build a monument that touches the sky, it must first build 100 smaller things that collapse into the mud. Look at the shifting sands of Egypt. The Great Pyramids of Giza did not simply appear out of nowhere. If you trace the timeline back before 2500 BCE, you find the physical evidence of a culture slowly learning how to construct stone monuments. You find mastabas, simple, flat-roofed tombs. Then, generations later, you find the step pyramid of Djoser, an ambitious leap forward. And then, you find the tragic beauty of the collapsed pyramid at Medum. The architects in early Egypt miscalculated the angle of the walls. The outer casing gave way, and the structure crumbled. This is developmental debris. It is the undeniable physical proof of a human mind struggling with gravity, making a catastrophic mistake, and learning from it. We see this same methodical rhythm in ancient China. The mastery of bronze casting, the development of rammed earth walls, the cultivation of crops along the Yellow River. None of this happened overnight. It was a slow burn over thousands of years. It left behind layers of primitive pottery, early village foundations, and the gradual refinement of tools. This is how orthodox history tells us civilization works. It is a slow generational crawl from the cave to the city. As you rest tonight, listening to the echoes of these ancient builders, perhaps you can picture those early architects sketching their flawed plans in the dirt. If this journey into deep time is helping you unwind, I invite you to gently like this video and consider subscribing to the channel. Let your mind drift with us as we continue to uncover the mysteries of the past. Leaving a quiet comment helps our Midnight Archive grow, and your presence here means the world to me. Now hold that slow progression of Egypt and China in your mind and return with me to Mesopotamia. Return to the banks of the Euphrates River, where the Sumerians are laying the foundations of Uruk. This is where the narrative of linear human progress begins to fracture. Uruk does not crawl, it sprints. Around 3500 BCE, this massive urban centre simply materializes. The architecture is not primitive. The massive brickwork, the use of baked clay and bitumen to waterproof their structures, the interlocking irrigation canals, they're all executed with the quiet confidence of master builders. There are no collapsed pyramids in Sumer. There is no long, agonizing period of trial and error visible in the dirt beneath their oldest ziggurats. The complex infrastructure required to sustain tens of thousands of people in an unforgiving desert appears to have been deployed rather than discovered. They possessed advanced metallurgical techniques, creating precise alloys without leaving behind the slag heaps of early, failed experiments. To an archaeologist, this absence of failure is deeply unsettling. It is like finding a brilliant symphony written by a composer who never practiced playing a single scale. Every other culture left behind a messy trail of developmental debris. But something about that explanation remains incomplete when we look at the towering walls of Uruk. The timeline is too compressed. The knowledge is too mature. If the Sumerians learned these sophisticated skills naturally, over thousands of years of trial and error, just like the Egyptians and the Chinese, then where are the Sumerian mistakes buried? Imagine the long, sharp shadow of a ziggurat falling across the desert at dusk. It is a silhouette that does not belong to the natural world. It is a calculated, deliberate interruption of the horizon. When we look at these massive stepped pyramids rising from the flat plains of Mesopotamia, we are looking at something profoundly unsettling. They are mountains made of mud and baked clay, engineered with a precision that defies the orthodox timeline of human progress. Consider the sheer physical weight of the architecture. The base of a true ziggurat is a masterpiece of stress distribution. The builders used millions of bricks, each formed, baked, and laid with an exact understanding of load-bearing physics. The core of the structure is built of sun-dried mud brick, designed to be slightly flexible and yielding. The exterior is armoured with kiln-fired bricks, set perfectly in a waterproof mortar of natural bitumen. The builders even engineered weep holes into the terraces, allowing trapped moisture to escape so the massive weight of the structure would not tear itself apart from within, as the earth shifted beneath it. This is not the architecture of a culture experimenting with piling stones in the dirt. This is the architecture of a culture that already knew exactly what it was doing. Every heavy, grounded wall seems to mirror a profound mathematical certainty. Each block rests on the absolute confidence of the block beneath it. Cities usually grow organically over centuries. They start as a cluster of modest dwellings, expanding outward along rivers in a messy, chaotic sprawl. But the great early cities of the Sumerians, like Uruk, do not look like organic growth. They look like the execution of a pre-existing blueprint. The streets form deliberate, calculated grids. The canals are cut with mathematical precision, diverting the Euphrates River to feed a managed, high-yield agricultural machine. The granaries are standardized. The defensive walls are tactical masterpieces. To build at this scale, you need much more than just physical labor. You need an administration capable of calculating logistics for tens of thousands of workers over decades. You need advanced geometry. You need a unified system of standardized weights and measures. We expect to find the mistakes of early builders. We expect to find the collapsed walls of early attempts. The flawed foundations of architects learning their trade through centuries of trial and error. But that developmental debris simply is not there. The blueprint existed before the mud was ever mixed. It is as if the architects arrived with the final draft already in hand. They understood the mathematics of the arch and the dome thousands of years before Rome claimed them. They understood the intricate calculus of water pressure and drainage. As you lie there listening, suspended in the quiet darkness of your own room, take a moment to reflect on the sheer weight of that realization. If you are finding comfort in these late-night mysteries, consider leaving a gentle like, subscribing to the channel, or sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your presence here helps us continue to unearth these forgotten echoes of deep time. Let this space be a quiet sanctuary for your mind to wander as the modern world fades away. The geometry of the ziggurat is intimidating in its scale. It demands that we ask where this profound, sudden knowledge came from. But perhaps the answer is not hidden in the massive baked bricks of the high temples. Perhaps the true evidence of a pre-existing blueprint is not found in the macro scale of city planning, but in something much smaller. A city of this magnitude cannot be built without flawless coordination. Logistics on this level require a method of recording, measuring, and communicating complex instructions across vast distances and long spans of time. The architecture requires a code, and so, to understand the builders, we must look away from the towering shadows of the ziggurats. We must look down at the hands of the scribes. We must move from the massive, heavy scale of the city walls to the microscopic, precise scale of language. Look closer at the baked clay bricks of those impossible walls we just walked past. If you were to run your hand along their rough surface, you might feel the subtle, rhythmic indentations left behind. These are not merely the accidental marks of ancient masonry. They are the deliberate, precise impressions of a mind communicating across deep time. Imagine a scribe sitting by the banks of the Euphrates River, holding a freshly cut reed. The tip of this reed has been carefully shaped into a sharp, angular wedge. With a practiced, rhythmic motion, they press the stylus into a handful of wet, soft river mud. They do not drag the tool across the surface, they stamp it. A slight twist of the wrist creates a sharp, horizontal line. Another firm, downward press leaves a vertical anchor. A diagonal rotation forms a heavy triangular head. This is the mechanical birth of cuneiform. Mainstream history suggests that human writing always begins as simple pictures. We expect to find a crude sketch of a wheat stalk used to mean grain, or a wavy line to represent water. We expect a slow, agonizing evolution from primitive pictographs to abstract thought. We expect to sift through the developmental debris of a culture trying to figure out how to record its own voice. But in the shadow of Uruk, that expected debris is entirely missing. The script does not emerge from the earth as a series of hesitant, primitive scratches. It arrives as a fully operational, highly sophisticated system of exactly 700 symbols. 700 symbols. That is not a rough draft. That is a comprehensive, engineered framework capable of expressing complex administration, abstract poetry, and precise mathematics. The syntax found in the earliest layers of the Mesopotamian dirt is already mature. The grammar is entirely complete. To create a system of 700 distinct phonetic and logographic signs requires centuries of trial and error. Yet the physical evidence shows no such prologue. It is as if someone handed the Sumerians a completed dictionary. They simply picked up the reed stylus, prepared the wet clay, and began to transcribe. This is the profound anomaly of cuneiform completeness. If you find yourself awake tonight, pondering how a complete language could simply appear from the dust, perhaps you will leave a gentle like, or share a thought in the comments below. Your presence here, in these quiet hours, helps keep these ancient mysteries alive. Let us continue our descent into the archive. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay are not just simple tallies of sheep and barley. They possess complex grammatical modifiers. They have structural rules that dictate tense, relationship, and pluralization. They allow for the recording of deeply abstract concepts like justice, mortality, and the divine. To write in this script is an act of intense physical discipline. The clay must be perfectly tempered. It cannot be too wet, or it will fail to hold the sharp geometry of the wedge. It cannot be too dry, or it will resist the reed entirely. The scribe must work quickly. Before the baking sun of the ancient Near East sets the mud into unyielding stone, this physical reality makes the sudden standardization of the script even more baffling. This level of uniformity across massive urban centers defies conventional logic. You do not wake up one morning and convince tens of thousands of people to adopt a standardized alphabet of 700 symbols. It requires an academy. It requires an established intellectual infrastructure that simply did not exist a few centuries prior. Orthodox history asks us to believe that the brilliant inhabitants of this region simply conceptualized this vast linguistic network out of thin air. But something about that explanation remains incomplete. The sudden, flawless mastery of the reed and the clay feels less like an organic invention. It feels much more like an inheritance. It is as if they were taught a system that had already been perfected in an age we can no longer see. If this writing system was not slowly developed, but rather handed down perfectly formed, it changes the foundation of human history. We must look closely at what they chose to record with this sudden immaculate script. We must ask what the very first words written in this complex system were trying to say. Listen to the translation of the ancient scribes themselves. When Orthodox history looks at the sudden, breathtaking arrival of the Sumerians, it uses the word invention. We are taught that these people looked out over the muddy banks of the Euphrates River and simply willed civilization into existence. We assume they invented the wheel, invented the plough, and invented the mathematics necessary to build ziggurats. We assume they invented the 700 symbols of cuneiform to record it all. But something about that explanation remains incomplete. Because when we actually read the clay tablets, when we decipher the wedge-shaped marks pressed into the earth, we find something entirely different. The Sumerians never claimed to be inventors. They did not possess the pride of pioneers. They did not write sweeping epics about how they, through their own brilliance, conquered the natural world and birthed human progress. Instead, their texts are marked by a deep, almost melancholic humility. They viewed themselves not as the architects of a new age, but as the custodians of an old one. Over and over again, across different cities and different centuries, their scribes used a very specific phrase. They described their grand works, their towering walls, and their sacred laws as the restoration of what was before. Think about the precise weight of those words. Restoration of what was before. In our modern arrogance, we have spent centuries reading this as religious poetry. We treat their written records as the exaggerated mythology of a primitive people trying to make themselves sound important. But what if we applied textual literalism to their words? What if we simply believed them? When a Sumerian king recorded that he was instructed to rebuild a temple exactly according to the ancient ground plan, what if he meant exactly that? A literal, physical blueprint handed down from a time before his own. As you lie there tonight, listening to the quiet echoes of deep time, I invite you to leave a like on this video and perhaps subscribe to our journey. If these midnight explorations of the past bring you a sense of wonder, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your presence here helps keep this quiet archive open. Now, let your mind drift back to the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia. The Sumerians lived with a profound awareness of a lost epoch. They wrote of ancient knowledge that was handed down to them from a distant, almost incomprehensible past. Their cities were not laboratories of trial and error, but salvage operations. They were attempting to perfectly replicate a system that had already been perfected long before they were born. This is why we find no developmental debris. This is why there are no primitive, fumbling stages of their architecture or their mathematics. You do not need to invent the arch if you already hold the schematic. This concept of restoration changes everything. It strips away the comforting illusion of a straight, unbroken line of human progress. It suggests that civilization is not a ladder we have been slowly climbing since the dawn of humanity. Instead, it is a fragile inheritance. The clay tablet with a thumbprint is not the first draft of history. It is a desperate, meticulous copy of a vanished original. The Sumerians were trying to hold on to the memory of a world that had been shattered. They were gathering the scattered pieces of a broken mirror, trying to reflect a light that had gone out long ago. They were faithful scribes, copying documents they barely understood. They preserved mathematics that descended from the sky and built walls to protect the echoes of a silenced age. They told us, in their own words, that they were simply putting the pieces back together. But this forces us to confront a terrifying and exhilarating question. If they were restoring something, what exactly was lost? If the foundation of Sumerian society was built on the concept of restoration, we are forced to ask a simple, quiet question. What exactly were they restoring? To rebuild a shattered world, you need a blueprint. You need a memory of the architecture, the laws, and the lineage of the people who came before the silence. To understand how these ancient people viewed their own profound antiquity, we do not have to guess. We simply have to read their master ledger. Imagine standing in the dim, climate-controlled halls of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, long after the crowds have gone. Resting there, behind heavy glass, is an object known as the Weld-Blundell Prism. It is not a towering monolith or a grand golden statue. It is a modest, four-sided block of baked light brown clay, roughly 8 inches tall. A physical object you could hold comfortably in the palm of one hand. Down its vertical centre runs a hollow hole, designed so the block could be mounted on a wooden spindle and turned. And on its 4 faces, etched with microscopic precision, are 2 dense columns of cuneiform script. This unassuming piece of hardened earth is the Sumerian King List. It is the chronological spine of Mesopotamian history. And it is written with the cold, methodical precision of a bureaucrat. The scribes who rotated this prism on its wooden peg were not composing poetry to entertain a royal court. They were recording a political and historical chain of custody. They were documenting the unbroken line of kingship, tracing the transfer of power from one city to the next across vast oceans of time. They were looking back into what they called the distant days. That phrase alone carries a haunting weight. To a Sumerian scribe working in the year 2000 BCE, the origins of their world were already impossibly old. They stood in the shadow of their own antiquity, gazing back at the distant days with a sense of profound reverence and clinical detachment. As we slowly rotate this ancient prism together in the stillness of the night, I invite you to let the heavy machinery of the modern world slip away. Settle deeper into the quiet. If you find yourself drifting peacefully alongside these ancient mysteries, please consider leaving a gentle like or subscribing to our journey. Your presence here, in this late-night archive, allows us to keep turning the pages of deep time. Let your breathing slow, and allow the dust of the ancient world to settle around you. When we look closely at the Sumerian King List, we find a document that Orthodox history accepts with open arms, but only up to a point. It is a text defined by a striking duality. If you read the later sections of the clay prism, the names and the lengths of the reigns align perfectly with the established archaeological record. We find kings who lived normal human lifespans, men who fought verifiable wars, signed treaties, and built physical temples whose brick foundations we can still touch today. The end of the list is universally accepted as a strict factual accounting of reality. But a ledger is not meant to be read from the bottom up. It is meant to be read from the beginning. And this is where the story becomes more difficult. When we reach up to spin the prism back to its very first column, back to the rulers of the distant days, the timeline fractures. The familiar rhythm of human generations suddenly falls away. The text does not change its tone. It does not suddenly announce that it is shifting into the realm of fantasy or religious allegory. It maintains the exact same dry, bureaucratic grammar used to describe the kings of the present. Yet, the data it presents begins to break the boundaries of uniformitarian history. As we look at the very first names pressed into the wet clay, we enter a chronological landscape that makes modern historians deeply uncomfortable. We're forced to confront an era where the numbers stop behaving, and history refuses to remain human. When kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alalangar ruled for 36,000 years. Two kings. They ruled for 64,800 years. These are the opening lines etched into the Weld-Blundell Prism. I want you to let the sheer weight of those numbers settle into the quiet space around you. 28,800 years for a single reign. The list continues with a methodical, uncompromising rhythm. Then Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira. There. Enmen-Luana ruled for 43,200 years. Enmen-Gal-Ana ruled for 28,800 years. The divine shepherd, Dumuzid, ruled for 36,000 years. These are the pre-flood lifespans, 8 kings in total, ruling over 5 cities. Their combined reigns stretch across a staggering duration of 241,200 years. And then, the text notes with chilling clinical brevity. The flood swept over the earth. 250,000 years of continuous rule, abruptly erased by a wall of water. It is a span of time so vast, so deeply alien to our understanding of human biology, that it swallows our entire recorded history dozens of times over. Orthodox history approaches these massive figures with a predictable and perhaps understandable dismissal. The mainstream consensus tells us that these are not literal years, and these were not literal men. They are categorized as mythological exaggerations. Historians suggest this was a political tool, a retrospective fiction engineered by later kings to manufacture a sense of divine antiquity. By stretching the reigns of their ancestors into the misty realms of deep time, the rulers of later cities could claim a direct, unbroken lineage to the gods. It is a very comfortable explanation. It allows us to neatly divide the Sumerian King List into 2 distinct halves. The first half is safely filed away as a fairy tale. The second half, where the numbers suddenly drop to normal human lifespans following the flood, is accepted as actual, verifiable history. As you lie there, drifting closer to the edge of sleep, perhaps you can feel the comforting appeal of that orthodox boundary. It keeps the walls of our reality intact. It protects us from the vertigo of deep time, if you are finding peace in the slow unwinding of these ancient mysteries. I invite you to gently like this video and perhaps subscribe to our journey. Leave a comment below if your mind too struggles to hold the sheer, impossible weight of 241,000 years. Your presence here, in this quiet archive of the past, helps keep these fragile memories alive. But something about that orthodox explanation remains deeply incomplete, and this is where the story becomes more difficult. To accept that these pre-flood lifespans are mere political fiction, we have to ignore everything we have already learned about the people who pressed these words into clay. Remember the character of the Sumerians. They were not romantic poets, weaving abstract fables to pass the time in the desert. They were the ultimate uncompromising pragmatists. They were the inventors of standardized weights, the architects of load-bearing physics, the masters of logistical supply chains. They designed complex irrigation grids that required absolute mathematical precision to function. They recorded the exact yields of grain, the specific ratios of copper and tin needed to forge bronze, and the precise daily rations of their workers. Their entire civilization was built on the rigorous, almost obsessive documentation of physical reality. The very concept of writing, the intricate wedge shapes of cuneiform, was born not from a desire to write mythology, but from the need to keep accurate ledgers. So we are faced with a profound, glaring contradiction. Why would the most mathematically obsessed, rigidly practical culture in the ancient world suddenly abandon their precision when recording their own origins? Why would a people who calculated the physics of monumental architecture down to the fraction of a millimetre open their most important historical and political document with pure, untethered fantasy? History loves to tell us that ancient people were prone to wild exaggeration, but the Sumerians were accountants, and accountants do not write fairy tales in their ledgers. So what if these pre-flood lifespans are not an exaggeration at all? What if we are simply misreading the math? To understand the impossible lifespans of the Sumerian King List, we must turn to the hidden key. we must look at the Sumerian obsession with base 60 geometry. When Orthodox history looks at a reign of 28,800 years, it sees a fairy tale. It sees a primitive scribe sitting in the dust, exaggerating the past to flatter his current ruler. History loves to assume that the ancients were simple, and simple minds, when left to invent mythology, invent random, chaotic numbers. They say a hero lived for 1,000 years, or 1,000,000. They do not calculate, but look closely at the clay of the Weld-Blundell Prism. Look at the data. The numbers recorded for these pre-flood kings are not random. They are perfectly, impossibly clean. They are the deliberate products of a highly disciplined mathematical mind. The Sumerians did not count in tens as we do today. They built their reality on the number 60. It is an elegant, highly divisible system. It is the very same system that still quietly dictates the ticking of the clock beside your bed tonight. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This invisible architecture of time was gifted to us by Sumer, and within this ancient system there is a master unit, a massive sacred block of calculation. The Sumerians called it the Sar. One Sar is exactly 3,600. It is 60 multiplied by 60. It is the mathematical cornerstone of their entire worldview. Now, apply this mathematical key to the distant days. Apply the Sar to those impossible kings who ruled before the Great Flood. King Alulim ruled the first city of Eridu for 28,800 years. Divide his reign by 3,600. The result is exactly 8. 8 perfect Sars. His successor, King Alalngar, ruled for 36,000 years. Divide that by 3,600. The result is exactly 10. 10 perfect Sars. In the second city, Bad Tabira, King Enmenlu-Ana is recorded as ruling for 43,200 years. Divide it again. The answer is exactly 12 Sars. The math never breaks. The pattern never wavers. The remainders are always exactly 0. Every single reign in the pre-flood section of the King List is a flawless, exact multiple of the Sar unit. This is where the orthodox explanation of simple mythology begins to fracture. A mythmaker, spinning a wild, imaginative tale of immortal gods, would not restrict himself to perfect mathematical equations. He would not ensure that every fictional reign was cleanly divisible by 3,600. Fantasy is messy, but the King List is clinical. You're not reading the boastful poetry of a primitive culture. You're looking at a spreadsheet. You're looking at a highly advanced formula, locked in baked clay, waiting patiently for someone to decode it. As you lie in the quiet of the night, listening to the echoes of these ancient calculations, take a moment to rest in the vastness of time. If this journey into the deep past brings you a sense of peace, please consider liking this video, leaving a gentle comment, and subscribing to our channel. Your quiet presence here helps us continue to unearth these forgotten truths, but the profound mystery remains. Why encode these specific multiples into the reigns of ancient kings? What earthly process requires a baseline of 3,600 years? When you see numbers that consistently hit massive mathematical benchmarks, you're not reading human biography. You're reading cosmic observation. You're looking at the records of a civilization that was tracking something far larger and far older than a single human life. The Sar is not merely a geometric tool for building temples. It is a celestial yardstick. To find the answer, we must pull our gaze away from the wet mud of Mesopotamia. We must look up into the night sky, because these perfectly encoded numbers do not describe the ticking of a terrestrial clock. They are tracking the slow, majestic, and inevitable movement of the stars. To truly understand the profound weight of what the ancient scribes were recording, we must momentarily leave the quiet dust of the archive. We must put down the clay tablet, step out into the cool, dark air of the Mesopotamian night, and simply look up. The night sky is the ultimate canvas of deep time. It is a slow, silent wheel of light, and if you watch it long enough, you realize that it is not fixed. The Earth wobbles on its axis, spinning like a slowing top in the dark. Because of this slight, persistent wobble, the background of the stars slowly shifts behind the rising sun. This movement is incredibly slow, almost imperceptible to a single human life. It is a phenomenon known to modern astronomy as the precession of the equinoxes. To complete one full wobble, to see the stars return to their exact starting positions, takes 25,920 years. This is the great year. the grand cosmic cycle. You cannot notice this shift in a day or a year or even a lifetime. It takes 72 years for the sky to shift just 1 single degree. To observe it, to map it, a civilization must watch, measure, and record the exact positions of the stars for thousands of years without interruption, without losing the data, without forgetting how to read the sky. And yet, when we look at the impossible numbers embedded in the Sumerian King List, this exact celestial mathematics stares back at us. Remember the SAR unit, that foundational block of Sumerian base 60 geometry, representing the number 3600. The reigns of the pre-flood kings are not random, chaotic fantasies born of primitive minds. They are perfect, precise multiples of the SAR. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. Alalngar ruled for 36,000 years. These are not biographical lifespans of mortal men. They are the gears of a cosmic clock. When you map the grand processional cycle against the base 60 mathematics of the Sumerians, you find a chilling, perfect harmony. The numbers are speaking a language of orbital mechanics, translated into political history. This is where the orthodox narrative of our past begins to fracture. We are told that the people of early Uruk were just discovering how to irrigate crops and build mud brick walls. But their foundational documents reveal an understanding of long-term celestial mechanics that requires millennia of continuous advanced scientific observation. They were measuring the slow turning of the earth itself. As you lie there tonight, listening to the quiet, take a moment to subscribe, to leave a gentle like on this video, and to share your thoughts in the comments. Join us as we drift further into the past. Think about the profound patience required to track a star over 10,000 years. It forces us to ask a deeply unsettling question. If the Sumerians had no developmental period, if they simply appeared in the historical record around 3500 BCE, they could not possibly have compiled this data themselves. They simply had not existed long enough to watch the stars drift across the great year. The math proves that they were not the astronomers. They were the archivists. They were holding on to the mathematics of a civilization that had watched the sky long before the first bricks of Uruk were ever laid. The pre-flood kings were not men. They were epochs. They were celestial tracking periods, handed down from a world that had mastered the geometry of the heavens. It is a beautiful, humbling thought. A lost civilization with its eyes fixed on the eternal turning of the cosmos, charting the deep mechanics of the universe in perfect peace. But this grand mathematical harmony did not last. Something broke the cycle. The King List is meticulously ordered, perfectly calculated, moving to the slow rhythm of the stars until it hits a sudden, violent wall. We must bring our focus back down from the heavens, back down to the earth. The celestial observation was interrupted. The sky was forgotten because the ground beneath them opened up. Trace the stylus down the artifact. The Weld-Blundell Prism rests quietly in the dim light, offering up the deepest memories of a forgotten world. We follow the wedge-shaped marks, reading the names of the kings who ruled in the distant days before the world changed. Alulim, Alalngar, Enmenluana, Dumuzid the Shepherd. With every name, the numbers hold their perfect crystalline geometry. The SAR unit dictates the rhythm, reaping tens of thousands of years. 241,200 years in total. Across just 8 rulers, the math is flawless. It is a cosmic clock ticking in deep time, reflecting the slow, majestic procession of the equinoxes. The scribe is recording an era of profound stability, a golden age governed by the precise movements of the stars. You can almost hear the steady, hypnotic turning of the great year as you read down the columns of clay. And then, a sudden stop. The rhythm breaks. The unbroken chain of celestial timekeeping simply ends. If you look closely at the clay, you can see the rupture. The scribe did not let the numbers gradually wind down. They did not transition softly from the realm of the eternal to the realm of the mortal. They pressed the stylus into the mud and drew a line, a boundary, a wall between 2 distinctly different realities. And beneath that line, the scribe carved a simple, devastating sentence. Then the flood swept over. 5 words in English. In the original Sumerian, it is just as terse, clinical, and completely devoid of melodrama. There is no poetic lamentation here. There is no weeping for the lost cities. It is recorded with the cold, detached precision of an administrator noting a destroyed ledger. Then the flood swept over. As you lie there tonight, drifting in the quiet space between waking and sleep, I want you to feel the weight of that silence, the silence that must have followed those words in the mind of the ancient scribe. If this quiet exploration of the forgotten past is bringing you a sense of peace or wonder, I gently invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave a soft like, or share your thoughts in the comments below. Your quiet presence in this late-night archive is what keeps these stories alive. Let us step back into the dark together, because what happens next on the clay tablet is even more unsettling than the flood itself. The text resumes. The scribe continues the list. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. But the world on the other side of that dividing line is fundamentally broken. The numbers tell the story. The perfect base 60 geometry of the pre-flood world vanishes. The SAR unit is gone. The cosmic clock has been smashed to pieces. The first king of Kish rules for 1,200 years, the next for 900. Then the lifespans begin to plummet, fracturing into messy, uneven, chaotic numbers. 600 years, 140 years, 36 years. The crystalline perfection of the distant days has been replaced by the mundane, fragile reality of human mortality. The math is no longer astronomical. It is desperate. It is human. The contrast is stark. Above the line, we have a unified, advanced system of celestial tracking. Below the line, we have the messy, clumsy developmental debris of a shattered world trying to rebuild itself in the mud. Orthodox history looks at this sudden, violent rupture in the text and offers a comfortable explanation. Scholars tell us that the flood is merely a literary device, a metaphor. They argue that the Sumerians used the idea of a deluge to separate their mythological heritage from their actual, historical political dynasties. It is just a story, they say, designed to legitimize a change in leadership. But something about that explanation remains incomplete. When you hold the text, when you trace the absolute collapse of their mathematical systems across that single line of clay, it does not feel like a metaphor. The Sumerians were not poets wrapping abstract ideas in pretty allegories. They were literalists. They measured grain, plotted the stars, and built perfectly aligned, massive structures. They did not use their sacred geometry lightly, and they would not have broken it just to make a political point. The data shifts too violently. The loss of knowledge is recorded too literally. The drop from cosmic time frames to mundane mortal lifespans reads exactly like a catastrophic loss of infrastructure. We are left standing at the edge of that dividing line in the clay, staring down into the dark, which forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Was this textual flood merely a metaphor for political change? Or was it something horribly real? We must leave the quiet, temperature-controlled darkness of the archive. We must set aside the Weld-Blundell Prism and step out into the blistering, unforgiving heat of the Mesopotamian desert. The air here is thick with dust, carrying the faint metallic scent of ancient earth. Listen to the wind as it moves across the flat, baked plains. It is a harsh, unyielding landscape where the sun bleaches the ruins of once great cities back into the pale soil from which they were raised. For generations, Orthodox history looked at the Sumerian texts and drew a firm, comfortable line. The dividing line of the flood, the moment the deluge swept over, was categorized safely as pure poetry. It was considered a convenient fiction, a mythological reset button used by ancient scribes to separate an imagined golden age of gods from the mundane, difficult reality of their present day. It was easy for scholars to dismiss. Words, after all, are light. A scribe can carve a catastrophe into a clay tablet without a single drop of rain ever falling. A civilization can invent a tragic origin story just to give its present existence a sense of profound meaning. But what if the text was not a metaphor? What if the sudden, catastrophic reset recorded in the clay was a literal physical event? To answer that question, we have to look past the cuneiform symbols. We have to stop reading the words and start reading the dirt. We must consult the silent, objective memory of geology. The earth does not write poetry. It only records what is heavy, what is real, and what is devastating. When we speak of this geological cataclysm, we must be precise. We are not speaking of a literal global ocean covering the highest mountain peaks of the entire Earth. That is the realm of much later theological interpretation. But to the people living between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, their world was a flat, fragile expanse bound by the horizon. A regional cataclysm of unprecedented scale, a massive surging inundation of water, mud and debris, would be, in every practical sense, a total world-ending event. For the Sumerians, the boundaries of their experience were the boundaries of the universe. If their entire known world drowned, then the world drowned. The destruction was absolute. Imagine standing at the edge of a deep excavation trench in the early 20th century. The sheer walls of the pit read like a barcode of human survival, layer upon layer of compacted soil, ash, broken pottery, and the scattered, mundane debris of daily life. As archaeologists dig deeper, they travel backward through time. Each foot of excavated earth represents centuries of continuous human habitation. They find the remnants of ancient hearths. They find the foundations of walls. They trace the unbroken lineage of civilization down into the deep, dark soil. As we stand on the edge of this deep historical abyss, I invite you to settle further into the quiet of the night. If this journey into the forgotten layers of time is bringing you comfort and curiosity, please consider leaving a gentle like, subscribing to our channel, or sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your presence here helps us keep the lantern lit, guiding us further down into the past. Close your eyes and let your mind drift down into the dust with us. Let us see what lies buried beneath the surface, because in this unbroken timeline of dirt and ash, there is a point where the rhythm of the earth suddenly breaks, a point where the continuous lineage of human habitation simply stops. In the 1920s, an expedition set out to read the earth just as scholars had read the clay. They went to the ancient ruins armed not with dictionaries but with picks and shovels, and there, beneath the scorching sun, one man would strike his spade against something impossible. He was about to dig deep enough to find the physical, undeniably muddy truth of the Great Dividing Line. Imagine the dust, the dry, heavy heat of southern Mesopotamia in the spring of 1929, the relentless sun beating down on the ruins of the ancient city of Ur. This is where the abstract, impossible numbers of the Sumerian King List finally meet the physical dirt of the earth. Here, an English archaeologist named Leonard Woolley was conducting a massive excavation. Woolley did not deal in myths. He did not care for ancient poetry or tales of angry gods. He dealt in the rigid laws of stratigraphy. He dealt in pottery shards, in collapsed brick, in the tangible, undeniable debris of human lives. He was standing near the edge of a deep pit, watching his workers slowly remove human history layer by layer. Digging is simply time travel by shovel. The further down into the earth you go, the further back in time you reach. The workers dug through the modern topsoil. They found the graves of late Sumerian kings. They documented these treasures, cleared the chambers, and kept digging. As we descend further into this excavation together, if you're finding yourself drawn into the quiet depths of this mystery, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave a gentle like, or share a quiet thought in the comments below. Let it be a marker of your presence here in the dark as we continue to drift deeper into the past. The workers went deeper. The air in the trench grew stagnant and cool. The earthen walls of the pit rose higher, slowly blocking out the light of the modern world. They descended past the early dynastic periods. They dug past the remnants of the first known kings, down into the shadows of 3000 BCE. As they moved downward, the pottery changed. The tools became simpler. The grand architecture vanished. This was exactly what they expected to find. This was the slow, comforting rewind of human capability that orthodox history demanded. The deeper you go, the simpler the humans must be. Down they went, down into the Ubaid period, 4000 BCE. The artifacts here were primitive, rough-painted pottery, hand-shaped clay sickles. The workers were now standing at the bottom of a shaft nearly 40 feet deep. They were standing at the absolute baseline of what history claimed was the beginning of civilization. According to the textbooks of the time, there should have been nothing below this depth. Just the virgin, untouched earth of a world before human ambition. The story was supposed to be over. But Woolley watched from the edge of the pit, and the workers kept scraping at the earth, and then the rhythm of the dig was broken. The shovels hit something that did not make sense. They did not hit bedrock. They did not hit the cruder tools of hunter-gatherers. They hit clay. But not the clay of human hands. It was pure, clean, water-laid silt. Smooth, sterile, and entirely devoid of human ash, broken pots, or bone. To a casual observer, it was just mud. But to an archaeologist standing in the blinding heat of 1929, it was a terrifying impossibility. This specific kind of pristine silt is only deposited by water, by massive, overwhelming amounts of water. And yet, this thick layer of sterile mud was buried perfectly beneath the oldest known human settlements. The workers dug into the blank clay. They dug through 1 foot of it, then 2 feet, then 3. The history of the world had suddenly gone completely silent. They were digging through an empty void in time, a massive geological interruption. And as their shovels finally broke through the bottom of that deep, sterile mud, scraping against what lay buried underneath, they were about to uncover a truth that history had tried very hard to drown. The excavation trench at Ur was a vertical timeline. With every foot the local workers dug downward, they stepped further back into human memory. They sifted through the broken pottery of the Sumerians. They dug past the ash of ancient hearths. They moved through the discarded shells of daily life, layer by layer, century by century. And then, the history simply stopped. The pottery vanished. The charcoal disappeared. The bones and the beads were gone. The soil itself changed colour and texture. What the workers struck was pure, clean mud. It was a layer of water-laid silt. To an archaeologist, this is a familiar sight. It is known as virgin soil. It is the sterile earth that exists before human beings arrive to build and discard and die. It represents the absolute bottom of the historical record. When you hit virgin soil, the story is over. You have reached the empty stage before the actors walked on. The workers prepared to pack up their tools. But Leonard Woolley looked at the depth of the trench. He looked at the elevation of the mound. Something in the physical landscape did not make sense to him. The numbers did not align. He gave an order that must have sounded like madness to his crew. He told them to keep digging. They were told to dig into the sterile earth, to excavate the emptiness. And so, they dug. They pushed their spades into the dense, heavy mud. They dug through 1 meter, nothing. They dug through 2 meters, still nothing. Just the suffocating silence of river silt. In total, they cut through 2.5 meters of pure, unblemished clay. 2.5 meters. In geological terms, for water to deposit that much sediment in a single event, the floodwaters must have been incomprehensibly deep. They must have stood over the land for a very long time, drowning the plains, suffocating everything beneath a dark, stagnant sea. It was a physical manifestation of erasure. But then, the spades hit something different. The texture of the earth fractured. The clean, sterile clay finally gave way, and history began again. Beneath 2.5 meters of flood mud, they found a completely different world. They found hand-painted pottery. They found flint implements. They found the remains of a highly developed civilization that had been entirely smothered by the waters. The sterile clay layer was not the beginning of the world. It was a grave. It was a geological firewall, separating 2 distinct eras of human existence. Just imagine standing at the bottom of that trench, looking up at the walls of dirt. Above your head is the dawn of recorded history, the Sumerians, the ziggurats, the invention of the wheel, the birth of writing. But right in front of your face is a thick, dead band of clay, a monument to total destruction, and beneath your boots, an older world, a shattered reality that the Sumerians only whispered about in their most sacred texts. As we stand here in the quiet dark of this realization, I invite you to settle deeper into your rest. If this journey through the layers of time brings you a sense of peaceful wonder, please take a soft moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Does the idea of a forgotten world beneath the mud bring you comfort or a quiet sense of dread? Your engagement is the lantern that allows us to keep digging into these nocturnal mysteries. Woolley's discovery changed everything. The mythological dividing line in the Sumerian King List was no longer just poetry. It was a physical reality you could touch with your own hands. The timeline of human progress was not a single, unbroken string of slow evolution. It was violently severed. The Sumerians had told the truth. The flood swept over. and this changes the entire architecture of human history. Because if the flood was a real physical cataclysm, then the sudden, unexplained brilliance of the Sumerians on the other side of that mud makes a terrifying kind of sense. They were not inventing a new world, they were waking up in the ruins of an old one. The sheer weight of that clay layer forces us to ask a difficult question. What happens to a species when its world is washed away? What happens to the survivors who crawl out of the mud, holding the shattered fragments of high science, mathematics and engineering in their hands? The sterile clay is the physical barrier. To understand the true origin of humanity, we have to look at what was salvaged from the other side. But if we stop at Orthodox history still has a comfortable escape route. A single, localized flood is easy to dismiss. Rivers burst their banks, monsoons arrive with unexpected fury. Localized disasters happen all the time in the ancient world, and they do not require us to rewrite the timeline of human civilization. For the sterile clay layer to be the definitive dividing line of history, for it to represent the true cataclysm described in the ancient texts, it had to be larger. It had to be a regional wipeout. So, we must step out of Leonard Woolley's excavation trench and look outward across the wider Mesopotamian basin. We must ask if the Earth remembers this trauma anywhere else. The answer lies to the north. We travel up the river valleys to the ancient city of Kish. According to the Sumerian King List, Kish was the very first city where kingship was lowered from heaven after the waters finally receded. It was the first beacon of the new surviving world, and when archaeologists dug beneath the ruins of Kish, they bypassed the upper layers of human habitation. Down they went, past the broken pottery and the fallen mud brick walls, and there it was, another massive band of water-laid silt, a thick, uninterrupted layer of alluvial mud, devoid of human remains, sealing the older world beneath it. The pattern was repeating. The steady, logical stacking of geological facts was beginning to corner the skeptics. But there was one more site that needed to be checked, a city central to the entire Sumerian mythos, the ancient city of Shuruppak. In the epic poems, Shuruppak was the hometown of the Sumerian flood hero, the man who supposedly built the great vessel to survive the deluge. If the myth was merely a poem, the soil of Shuruppak would show nothing unusual. It would just be another dusty ruin, built slowly over time like any other. But when the trenches were cut deep into Shuruppak, the earth told the exact same story. Archaeologists found a distinct heavy deposit of flood clay. It neatly separated the early painted pottery of the Ubaid period from the later sudden explosion of mature Sumerian culture. The geology perfectly matched the geography, first then Kish, and finally Shuruppak. These were not neighbouring villages. They were separated by vast stretches of desert and river valley. For the same sterile clay layer to blanket all these specific major cities, the volume of water required is almost unimaginable. We are not talking about a heavy rainy season. We are looking at the geological footprint of a cataclysm that swallowed the entire known world of the people living there. Hundreds of miles of civilization wiped entirely clean. Millions of tons of mud dropped simultaneously across the cradle of civilization. Imagine the sheer weight of that water. It did not just wash away buildings, it erased the very contours of the land. It leveled the topography, filling in valleys and burying the achievements of an entire epoch beneath a suffocating blanket of wet, featureless earth. As you lie there tonight, listening to these echoes of deep time, I invite you to gently close your eyes and picture that silent, desolate landscape. A world wiped completely blank, waiting to be rebuilt. If you are finding peace in these ancient mysteries, please consider leaving a like, sharing your thoughts in the comments, or simply subscribing to join us on these late-night journeys. Your quiet presence here helps keep this archive open. Let us return to the mud. The corroboration of this evidence changes everything. It strips away the comfort of treating the Sumerian King List as a fantasy. When the text says, "Then the flood swept over," it is not speaking in metaphors. It is not a moral allegory about human hubris or a dramatic story told around a campfire. It is a dry, clinical record of a regional wipeout. The physical reality is now solidly in place. The world of the distant days, with its impossible lifespans, its strange geometry, and its forgotten kings, was truly drowned. When the earth itself speaks, the stories we tell ourselves must change. We are accustomed to thinking of ancient myths as the childhood dreams of our species. We imagine early humans sitting around a fire, inventing monsters and heroes to make sense of a chaotic world they did not understand. But what happens when the ground beneath our feet confirms the story? What happens when the silent, sterile clay of the excavation trench perfectly matches the words pressed into the cuneiform tablets? There is a profound, almost unsettling shift in perspective that occurs in this moment. The epic poems we have comfortably filed away under folklore suddenly demand to be read differently. The ancient tales of raging waters and darkened skies are no longer metaphors for seasonal rains, they become something far heavier. They become a forensic report. They stand as a literal, clinical memory of a day when the world ended. Imagine the psychological weight of this realization. For centuries, Orthodox history has taught us that human progress is an unbroken upward line. It is a comforting narrative. It makes us feel secure, positioned at the absolute pinnacle of an ongoing triumph. But the mud of Mesopotamia suggests a different architecture of time. It introduces a concept that is deeply humbling and quietly terrifying. The historical reset. A historical reset is not a mere pause in development. It is an erasure. It is the sudden, violent removal of an entire epoch, leaving only shadows and fragments behind. It implies that civilization is not a permanent achievement. It is fragile. It is a temporary structure built on the edge of a restless planet. The 2.5 meters of water-laid silt beneath represents the physical boundary of a reset. Below it lies a world that was erased. Above it lies a world that was built by desperate survivors. Think about the scribes who carved the Sumerian King List. When they drew that meticulous dividing line in the clay, separating the distant days from the world they knew, they were not inventing a dramatic narrative device. They were drawing a map of human trauma. They were documenting the exact fracture point of their own reality. This changes how we must view everything that came after. The suddenness of Uruk, the complete unblemished arrival of base 60 geometry, the standardized weights, the massive ziggurats, the 700 logographic signs of their written language. We previously asked how a primitive people could invent such wonders overnight without a trail of developmental debris. But if the regional wipeout was real, and the historical reset is a physical fact, the question changes completely. They did not invent these things from nothing. They remembered them. They salvaged them from the wreckage of the world that drowned. There is a deep melancholic beauty in this thought. It means humanity is far older and has endured far more than we typically dare to imagine. We are not just pioneers walking blindly into the future. We are inheritors, carrying the fading blueprints of a forgotten past. The dread of the cataclysm softens into a profound awe for human endurance. To survive an erasure of that magnitude, and to somehow hold on to the complex mathematics of the stars, the physics of load-bearing walls, and the very concept of written memory. It is a testament to an unimaginable resilience. As you lie there in the dark, listening to these echoes from the ancient mud, allow yourself to feel the vastness of that timeline. Allow the comforting illusion of our unbroken progress to fall away just for tonight. If this journey brings you a sense of quiet wonder, consider leaving a gentle like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to drift further into our forgotten past. We are living in the after. We are the children of the survivors. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the weight of thousands of years settle peacefully around you. It is quiet now. Wherever you are, whatever hour it is, the world around you has likely slowed down. The noise of the day has faded. In this stillness, the sheer weight of what we are discussing begins to settle. We have looked into the trench at Uruk. We have seen the sterile clay. We have touched the boundary where one version of humanity simply ended. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the reality of that silence wash over you. Think about our world for a moment. We consider ourselves so permanent. We build towering structures of glass and steel. We weave invisible webs of data across continents. We entrust our collective human identity to magnetic drives and fragile servers hidden in cold rooms. But water and time are the great unforgiving erasers. If the rivers swelled tomorrow, if the oceans rose and swallowed the coastlines, leaving behind 2.5 meters of water-laid silt over everything we know, what would actually survive? The glass shatters, the steel rusts, the servers decay into meaningless slag. Our digital ghosts would vanish in an instant. We are perhaps far more fragile than the ancient people of Uruk. They at least entrusted their legacy to the earth itself. They baked their memories into the mud. As we sit here in the dark, contemplating the cyclical nature of time, I want to ask you to pause. If you are finding peace in these ancient shadows, if this journey through deep time is helping your mind detach from the present, please consider leaving a gentle like on this video. It is a quiet gesture, but it helps this channel immensely. It allows us to keep exploring these forgotten corners of history together, undisturbed by the modern world. And I want to ask you a question, a thought to ponder as you drift closer to sleep. If the waters were to rise tonight and you could save just one piece of knowledge, one memory to press into a clay tablet for the people of the next epoch, what would it be? Leave a comment below, share your artifact with our Midnight Archive. Reading your thoughts in the quiet hours is a beautiful reminder that we're all just trying to preserve what matters. Let your mind linger on that thought. Imagine the absolute crushing silence that must have fallen over the Mesopotamian basin when the violent storms finally exhausted themselves. The roaring of the wind ceased, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and then to nothing. Imagine standing on the elevated ridges of the mountains, looking down at what used to be a thriving world. The great cities, the bustling markets, the towering ziggurats, all of it gone. Replaced by a flat, terrifying mirror of standing water reflecting a grey, indifferent sky. There were no birds, there was no movement in the brush. Just the heavy, suffocating weight of an ocean that had no right to be there. This is the historical reset. This is the moment where Orthodox history tells us humanity was slowly inventing the wheel. But the Earth itself tells an entirely different story. The Earth tells a story of an ending, but the water did not stay forever. Eventually the sun broke through the heavy clouds. The floodwaters began to slowly recede, draining back southward into the Persian Gulf, leaving behind that thick, sterile layer of virgin soil. The vast mudflats began to dry under the sun, and upon this blank canvas the survivors had to step out. They did not step out as primitive hunter-gatherers. They stepped out carrying the terrible heavy burden of memory. They possessed the blueprints of a drowned world, and they knew that if they did not act, everything they had lost would be forgotten entirely. So, let us leave our modern reflections behind once more. There is a deep, haunting isolation in being the one who remains. As we stand together in this Midnight Archive, sifting through the wreckage of deep time, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Leave a gentle like, or softly share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what single memory you would carry with you if the world washed away. Your presence here, in these quiet hours, helps keep these ancient echoes alive. Now, picture the few who stood on the higher ground. The ones who watched the floodwaters drop from the peaks of mountains or the decks of sealed vessels. They are not primitive people stepping tentatively into a new era of discovery. They are refugees from a highly sophisticated epoch. And they carry what we must call the survivor's burden. This burden is a psychological and physical weight that Orthodox history rarely accounts for. When a golden age is suddenly shattered by a regional wipeout, the immediate aftermath is never a time of joyful invention. It is a time of desperate, heartbroken salvage. You're standing in the ruins, knowing exactly how a complex society is supposed to function, but possessing none of the infrastructure to make it happen. You know what a city looks like. You know how the stars move. You know the mathematics of the cosmos. But your hands are covered in wet clay, and you have nothing to eat. The survivor's burden is the frantic, exhausting work of pulling a drowned world out of the mud before the memory of it completely evaporates. You do not have the luxury of slow, methodical evolution. You cannot wait 10,000 years to slowly figure out load-bearing physics or base 60 geometry. You already know these things. The challenge is simply writing them down before the elders die, and the knowledge is lost forever. This realization radically changes how we must view the suddenness of the Sumerian anomaly, the mysterious completeness of their writing system, the sudden rise of massive brick walls at Uruk. These were not the clumsy first steps of a new civilization. They were the precise, urgent notes of a culture performing historical triage. The act of pressing a reed stylus into clay became a life raft for human consciousness. They were encoding the distant days. They took the very mud that had destroyed their world, formed it into tablets, and used it to preserve the ghost of their civilization. They had to standardize weights and measures immediately to ration surviving grain. They had to calculate the precession of the equinoxes to understand if the heavens themselves had shifted. Every action was a desperate attempt at restoration, but human memory is a fragile vessel. It decays with every passing generation. The children born after the flood would only know the stories. They would never see the great cities that existed before the waters swept over. To them, the advanced survivors who taught them mathematics and engineering would seem entirely otherworldly. But before we reach that distant misunderstanding, we must look at the immediate aftermath, the days and months spent staring at the blank, drying earth. To truly grasp the scale of their monumental task, we have to look past the tragedy and focus on the mechanics of their survival. When the mud finally cracked in the sun and the survivors prepared to rebuild, we must ask, what tools did these survivors use to restart the clock of civilization? Listen closely to the space around you. Perhaps somewhere in the quiet of your room, a clock is ticking. A steady mechanical pulse, 1 second, then another. 60 seconds to complete a minute. 60 minutes to complete an hour. We accept this rhythm. We surrender our lives to it. We wake, we sleep, we work, and we wander according to the strict division of 60. But why 60? Why not 100? Why not 10? 10 is the math of biology. You have 10 fingers. You have 10 toes. When a child learns to count, they count in tens. It is the most organic, primitive, and predictable way for a developing mind to organize the physical world. But the clock in your room does not care about biology. The clock is a machine of pure engineered geometry, and that geometry is a ghost, a phantom transmission from the deep past. Every time you glance at your watch in the middle of the night, you're participating in a ritual that is over 5,000 years old. You're thinking in Sumerian. This is the legacy of base 60 mathematics, the sexagesimal system. It is an architecture so profound, so flawlessly constructed, that humanity has never found a reason to replace it. Consider the precise ticking elegance of the number 60. It is a highly composite number. It can be divided evenly, by 1, by 2, by 3, by 4, by 5, by 6, by 10, by 12, by 15, by 20, and by 30. No other number of its size offers such frictionless versatility. It allows a mathematician to calculate complex fractions without ever dealing with a messy remainder. It is the perfect number for geometry. It is the perfect number for dividing a circle into 360 degrees. It is the perfect number for mapping the vast dome of the night sky, tracking the slow precession of the equinoxes, and calculating the exact moment of a solar eclipse. Even now, if you were to open a map to find your exact location on this Earth, your coordinates would be given in degrees, minutes, and seconds, base 60, the inherited blueprint of the modern world. Before we look deeper into the unsettling suddenness of this math, if you're finding yourself drawn into these shadows of the past, please take a quiet moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your presence in this midnight archive is what helps us keep exploring. Now, let us return to the anomaly. The brilliance of base 60 mathematics is not the mystery. The mystery is how it arrived. Think about the developmental debris we discussed before, the slow, clumsy trial and error of human progress. To engineer a system as abstract and complex as base 60, a civilization must spend centuries making mistakes. They must argue over competing systems. They must leave behind clay tablets filled with primitive base 10 calculations before slowly realizing the mathematical superiority of 60. We should be able to dig into the mud of Mesopotamia and find the rough drafts. We should be able to trace the evolution of their thought. A slow, a precious, highly advanced tool, rescued from the dark waters of the flood and preserved by people who knew its immense value, even if they had long forgotten the minds that first engineered it. The elegance of base 60 mathematics is profound, but it is also invisible. It exists purely in the abstract, a ghost in the architecture of the mind. To truly understand the scale of what the Sumerians possessed, we must step out of the realm of numbers and pull our focus back down into the dirt. We must look at the physical sciences. We must examine their sudden mastery over metal and their clinical understanding of human flesh. Consider the sudden appearance of bronze. In the orthodox timeline of human progress, the leap from working soft native copper to forging true bronze is a monumental, agonizing struggle. It is not simply a matter of building a hotter fire. Bronze is a complex alloy. It is a deliberate chemical marriage of copper and tin is incredibly rare in the Mesopotamian basin. To create durable, usable bronze, you need precise metallurgical ratios, typically around 85 to 90% copper and 10 to 15% tin. Finding that perfect ratio requires an immense understanding of material science. It demands centuries of trial and error. You need to fail, over and over again. You should leave behind a vast trail of brittle, useless metal and the shattered moulds of botched castings. Yet the Sumerians did not fail. Around 3500 BCE, they were suddenly producing complex bronze tools, weapons, and intricate statuary with perfectly dialed-in metallurgical ratios. The developmental debris, the slag heaps of early clumsy experimentation, are entirely missing from the archaeological record. They skipped the rehearsal. They possessed the exact recipe for bronze before they ever lit the kilns at Uruk. And this eerie perfection extends from the heat of the forge to the fragility of the human body. When we imagine ancient medicine, we tend to picture superstition. We imagine incantations, spiritual curses, and desperate pleas to unseen gods. But the Sumerian medical tablets, pressed into clay thousands of years ago, tell a very different story. When archaeologists translated these medical archives, they did not find the ravings of primitive shamans. They found clinical procedural manuals. The texts are divided into strict logical categories: symptoms, diagnoses, prescriptions. They possessed two distinct classes of healers. There was the spiritual healer, yes, but there was also the clinical physician, operating entirely on the physical plane. These physicians described the washing of wounds with alkaline substances, effectively creating a rudimentary antibacterial soap, millennia before the germ theory of disease was formally understood. They detailed the extraction of cataracts using specialized instruments. They catalogued hundreds of botanical and mineral compounds, noting exact dosages, methods of administration, and potential side effects. They prescribed specific mixtures of crushed turtle shell, salt and alkaline ash to cleanse infections. It reads less like magic and more like a salvaged medical textbook. This is the profound signature of inherited sciences. It is the application of highly advanced knowledge without the cultural memory of its discovery. The Sumerians knew exactly how to mix the bronze, and they knew exactly how to treat the infection. But the centuries of agonizing research required to attain that knowledge are simply not there. They were operating a complex machinery that someone else had built. They were reading from a blueprint they did not draft. As we sit here in the quiet dark, sifting through these impossible records, let your mind wander over the implications of such a reality. If you find yourself captivated by these midnight investigations, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your presence here helps keep these archives open, allowing us to drift further together into the shadows of deep time. We are left staring at a civilization that functions like a fully equipped laboratory, miraculously appearing in the mud of the ancient world. They had the celestial mathematics, they had the metallurgical precision, they had the clinical medicine, but a laboratory cannot build itself from nothing, and a textbook must have an author. If all of this was truly a restoration of what was before, as their own texts claim, we must ask a difficult question. How could one isolated culture inherit all this perfection without a parent civilization to teach them? Listen to the sound of the language itself. Imagine a voice echoing in the dark, speaking a tongue with no family tree. We have looked at the sudden arrival of their cities. We have examined the pristine perfection of their inherited sciences, their base 60 mathematics, and their clinical medicine. But there is another anomaly resting inside the cuneiform archives, one that cannot be explained by missing developmental debris or lost archaeological trenches. It is the very words they used to describe their world. The Sumerian language is a ghost. It haunts the ancient clay, speaking in a vocabulary that defies the natural laws of human communication. To understand why this is so deeply unsettling, we need to step back and look at how languages live and breathe. Languages are organic. They are born from older languages. They mingle. They borrow. They leave behind a trail of genetic evidence. English, Russian, Hindi, and Spanish are all distant cousins, sharing a massive ancestral root system known as Indo-European. Arabic, for over a century, linguists have compared it to ancient Turkish. They have looked for echoes in Hungarian. They have searched the high mountains of Tibet, hoping to find a single surviving root word that matches. But every attempt has failed. Sumerian stands in total terrifying isolation. As you lie in the dark tonight listening to these voices from the deep past, I invite you to settle in and join our quiet community. If you find peace in these midnight mysteries, please consider leaving a gentle like, commenting below on what ancient secrets keep you wondering, and subscribing to the channel. Your support is the quiet lantern that keeps this archive illuminated, allowing us to drift further into the past together. Now let us return to the silence of the clay. Think about the profound implications of a language with no ancestors. A complex, highly structured grammatical system like Sumerian requires thousands of years of evolution. When they leave behind dialects, borrowed phrases, and primitive proto-languages. We can trace the Indo-European family tree back through millennia, watching the branches slowly converge. But Sumerian, this haunting ghost tongue we have uncovered, offers absolutely none of that. It arrives on the historical stage fully formed, intellectually mature, and utterly alone. It is a linguistic orphan, and orphans, by logical definition, once had parents. Let us slowly connect the dots. We know from the deep excavation trenches at Ur that a massive catastrophic regional wipeout occurred. We know that a 2.5-meter wall of sterile water-laid silt physically separates the ancient world into a before and an after. If this sophisticated language has no evolutionary roots in the soil above that clay layer, the deduction is as chilling as it is inevitable. Its roots must lie below it. The implications of this thought are profoundly heavy. It suggests, as we sit, what stories did this ghost tongue tell about its own origins? We have looked at the stones they stacked. We have traced the base 60 mathematics they used to measure the slow procession of the equinoxes. We have listened to the shape of their isolated orphaned language standing alone as the ultimate fossil of a drowned parent culture. But to truly understand the nature of the world they inherited, we must open the tablets that record the very beginning of humanity. And this is where the story becomes more difficult. This is where we must cross the boundary from the hard, undeniable reality of the excavation trench into the realm we so comfortably label as mythology. Orthodox history has a very specific way of dealing with ancient texts that do not fit the slow, linear model of human progress. When an ancient clay tablet documents grain allocations, historians treat it as absolute truth. When a text describes the building of a canal, it is accepted as historical fact. But the moment a text describes something outside our accepted evolutionary timeline, such as the deliberate creation of human beings, we immediately relegate it to the category of poetry. We assume that our ancestors were primitive, frightened people, huddled around fires, inventing elaborate fairy tales to explain a universe they could not comprehend. We treat their most carefully preserved records as the imaginative babbling of a young species. But what if that assumption is entirely backward? What if the Sumerians were not writing poetry at all? I want to introduce a framework for how we look at the distant past, a concept we can call the literalism of myth. What if these ancient scribes were writing technical documentation, using the only vocabulary available to them to describe processes of immense complexity? Consider how a person from the 14th century might describe a modern smartphone. They might write of a smooth, dark mirror that captures the souls of distant people, or a glowing stone that speaks with the voice of the dead. To a historian reading that text 3,000 years later, it would sound like pure mythological fantasy. But the medieval observer was not inventing a fairy tale. They were not lying. They were simply translating a highly advanced technology through the limited linguistic filter of their time. The desperate preservation of knowledge after a regional wipeout demands that we afford the Sumerians this exact same intellectual respect. As we prepare to look at these oldest of texts, I invite you to let your mind drift and to settle deeper into the quiet dark of this midnight archive. If this journey through deep time is bringing you a sense of calm wonder, please consider leaving a gentle like on this video and subscribing to the channel. Tell me in the comments below, what ancient myth do you suspect might actually be a misunderstood memory of something real? Your thoughts help keep this archive open for all who wander the night. Now, let us return to the clay. The Sumerians left us extensive, highly detailed records regarding the origin of our species. For over a century, scholars have read these creation epics as philosophical allegories. They have praised the beautiful metaphors of God shaping mankind from the mud of the earth. But to understand the true weight of the Sumerian anomaly, we must apply the principle of textual literalism. We must read the words exactly as they were pressed into the clay. We are not looking for spiritual metaphors meant to comfort the soul. We are looking for procedural records. We are looking for the clinical step-by-step observation of a biological process. I ask you to do something challenging as you listen tonight, as you drift closer to sleep. I ask you to temporarily strip away all of your modern religious preconceptions. Forget the majestic, instantaneous creations found in later religious traditions. Forget the idea of infallible deities speaking the universe into existence with a single, perfect command. The texts we are about to open do not describe magic. They describe work. They describe a clinical, frustrating, and deeply physical process of trial and error. They describe a laboratory. We step into a space that feels less like a divine sanctuary and more like a quiet, dimly lit workspace. There is no magical void here, no spoken words echoing across an empty cosmos, commanding light or life to simply exist. Instead, there is the heavy physical reality of labor. We find two figures, Enki, the architect of the endeavor, and Ninmah, the skilled artisan of form. They are bent over their materials, their hands deep in the subterranean clay. This is the physical transition into the Sumerian epic known to us as Enki and Ninmah. When we approach this text through the traditional lens of Orthodox history, we are told to read it as a poem, an allegorical fantasy. But when you actually read the cuneiform, when you strip away the centuries of mythological projection, the poetry dissolves. What remains is a stark, methodical record, a procedural description of a biological undertaking. They are not waving hands to conjure life from nothingness. They are working the clay, they are mixing, they are binding, they are measuring specific portions of the earth, combining it with a vital essence. The text describes the use of the blood and spirit of a slain entity, a physical catalyst required to animate the inert material. Listen to the rhythm of the translation. It does not describe a miracle, it describes a sequence of operations. It details the preparation of the workspace, the gathering of specific necessary components, the careful step-by-step assembly of a new biological vessel. Enki provides the blueprint, the underlying structure and intelligence of the design. Ninmah acts as the physical mechanism, the biological incubator through which the design must be realized. They are surrounded by lesser figures, assistants who observe the process, waiting to see if the binding will hold. This is where the orthodox view of myth begins to feel entirely inadequate. If this were purely a story of omnipotent gods, the act of creation would be instantaneous. It would be flawless. A true god does not need to measure, to mix, to struggle with the physical limitations of their materials. But Enki and Ninmah do struggle. They're bound by the physical laws of the medium they're working with. The text describes an environment of focused attention, the undeniable atmosphere of a laboratory, a place where an experimental procedure is quietly underway. As you lie there, suspended between waking and sleep, picture this ancient workspace. The sharp scent of wet earth and copper, the quiet murmurs of adjustment, of calculation, of trial. If you're finding yourself drawn deeper into this midnight archive, consider leaving a gentle like or subscribing to our journey. Your presence here in the dark helps keep these forgotten records alive. Now, let us return to the workbench. The procedure continues. The material is prepared. The essence is bound to the earth. Ninmah takes the prepared substance, acting as the surrogate for the experiment. Time passes, marked by the methodical observation of the makers. The text notes the gestation, the waiting, and then the culmination of their intense labour is brought forth. But this is where the narrative sharply diverges from the comforting myths of absolute divine perfection. In a purely poetic myth, the first human would step out of the clay in flawless form. A masterpiece of divine will ready to inherit the earth. That is the story we're used to hearing. But Enki and Ninmah are not performing magic. They're executing a complex physical process, and physical processes are vulnerable to failure. The binding is imperfect. The ratios of earth to essence are slightly miscalculated. The biological mechanism misfires. As they observe the results of their labour on the workbench of antiquity, a chilling realization settles over the workspace. Their first attempts to forge a human being were not perfect. They were not the pinnacle of creation. They were, in fact, something else entirely. When we read the ancient text of Enki and Ninmah, We are not reading a triumphant hymn of divine magic. We are reading the list of the broken vessels, the humans that did not work, the biological prototypes that failed on the assembly line of creation. Ninmah, acting as the chief medical officer of this ancient narrative, takes the material, the clay of the earth, mixed with the essence of a slain god, and begins to shape it. But the process is not perfect. It is fraught with the unpredictable variables of genetics and biology. It is a clinical trial recorded in the damp earth. The text records 6 specific attempts, 6 distinct prototypes that emerge from the laboratory, each carrying a fundamental flaw in their design. Listen to the clinical, tragic detail preserved in the cuneiform. The first prototype is a human who cannot bend their outstretched hands. The joints are locked. The physical mechanics have failed. The second is a human who is blind. The optical pathways did not form. The sensory input is missing. The third is a human with paralyzed feet. The motor functions are disconnected. The fourth is a human who suffers from incontinence, unable to hold back their urine. The internal regulatory systems are incomplete. The fifth is a barren woman. The reproductive sequence has stalled. The sixth is a creature without external genitalia. These are not abstract moral failings. These are not sins or spiritual metaphors or poetic allegories for the human condition. They are specific physiological defects. They are the exact kinds of biological errors that occur when a complex organism is being engineered, and the genetic code is still unstable. The text describes Enki and Ninmah looking upon these broken vessels not with divine wrath, but with the frustrated calculation of scientists. They do not destroy the prototypes. They assign them roles in society where their defects can be accommodated. The blind are given work in the musical arts. The barren are placed in administrative roles. It is a hauntingly pragmatic solution to a laboratory error. But something about this explanation remains incomplete. We must ask ourselves why an ancient scribe would invent such a story. Pure imagination creates instant perfection. When a culture invents a myth from nothing, their gods are absolute. A deity speaks into the void, and a flawless human is formed in an instant. That is how theology works. But memory is different. Memory records the messy, frustrating, and often tragic process of trial and error. If the Sumerians were simply making up a story about their own origins, why would they depict their creators as clumsy? Why would they meticulously document the physiological failures of the gods? The literalism of the myth points not to religious fantasy, but to salvaged historical observation. They were remembering a time when life was a process of experimentation. As you lie there in the quiet of the night, listening to the echoes of these ancient experiments, consider the profound strangeness of this story. We are taught to view our ancestors as simple dreamers, but perhaps they were simply the scribes of a reality far more clinical than we want to admit. If this journey into the deep past is giving you something to ponder, gently leave a like on this video. Share a thought in the comments below if you are still awake with us. It helps this quiet archive grow, and it connects you to the others who wander these midnight halls. The tragedy of the failed human prototypes forces us to confront a deeply unsettling anomaly. The beings described in these texts are called gods by the later generations. They are worshipped, feared, and exalted. Yet, in their own earliest records, they make mistakes. They struggle with the biological material. They have to try, over and over again, until they finally engineer a stable human vessel. And this is where the story becomes more difficult. We must look at the nature of these creators, because if they were truly omnipotent cosmic deities, why would a god need to practice? When we re-evaluate these ancient creation epics, stepping away from the comforting shield of poetry, a profound and quiet disorientation begins to set in. We are forced to look at the Sumerian words not as the primitive imagination of a young species, but as the desperate, limited translations of a surviving scribe. We must view them as an attempt to document a memory of science that had outlived the vocabulary needed to describe it. Consider the materials used by Enki and Ninmah in their assembly process. The texts are deeply, uncomfortably specific. These gods do not simply speak humanity into existence out of the void. There is no magical incantation that instantly produces a flawless human being. Instead, the process requires physical substances. It requires the blood of a specific chosen entity and the clay of the earth. For generations, Orthodox history has smiled at this description. Blood and mud. the crude, predictable building blocks of a primitive mind trying to explain the soft tissues of the human body. But what if we afford these biological texts the exact same literal respect we afford their base 60 astronomical calculations? A scribe living thousands of years ago trying to document a salvaged memory of biological engineering does not have the vocabulary for genetics. They have no word for a double helix. They have no concept of cellular scaffolding. They have no language for DNA. They only have the language of their immediate physical reality. If you were a scribe tasked with describing the insertion of advanced inherited genetic instructions into a base, earthly hominid, how would you write it? You might describe taking the vital essence, the inherited life force of the advanced beings, represented by blood, and binding it into the malleable, native organic material of the planet, represented by the clay. The blood is the genetic code. The clay is the earthly substrate. This is where the story descends into the uncanny valley of ancient science. As you read the Enki and Ninmah texts, the atmosphere is not one of divine majesty. It is sterile. It is methodical. It reads, chillingly, like a clinical laboratory report. The Sumerian word often translated as essence or spirit in these texts is tima. It implies a binding, a memory, or an instruction set that gives form to the formless. They mix the tima with the blood, a vital instruction set bound into a biological fluid, and the location of this procedure is explicitly named. It happens in a place called the Bit Shimti. In Orthodox translations, this is called the House of Destiny. But if we look closer at the root words, Shi means breath or life, and Imti means clay, the house of the breath of clay, the laboratory room where organic material is animated by a deliberate, measured process. As the night deepens around you, and the noise of the modern world fades into quiet, I invite you to gently leave a like or a comment, sharing your own thoughts on this ancient laboratory. Your quiet engagement helps this midnight archive grow, allowing us to wander further into these deep mysteries together, long after the rest of the world has gone to sleep. Think about the sheer mechanical reality of what the Sumerians recorded in that house of clay. The texts describe Enki purifying the space, washing his hands, and measuring the proportions exactly. They describe surrogate mothers, the birth goddesses who must carry these hybrid embryos to term. The text notes a gestation period of 10 lunar months. The gods could not bypass the laws of mammalian reproduction. They had to wait. They had to observe. They had to endure the biological timeline of the Earth, watching as the physical vessels formed in the dark. After the 6 failed prototypes, the barren, the blind, the neurologically compromised vessels, they finally stabilize the genetic matrix. They produce a viable, self-replicating biological vessel. A vessel capable of understanding commands, holding tools, and surviving the harsh Mesopotamian sun. But this realization brings with it a much darker, heavier question. Biological engineering is not undertaken for amusement. It is a resource-intensive, highly deliberate act of creation. You do not build a complex self-sustaining machine without a very specific task in mind. And this is where the story becomes more difficult. If humanity was engineered in the sterile rooms of the Bit Shimti, what was the purpose of the machine? Look at the tools placed into the hands of the first successful human. When we read the surviving records from the House of the Breath of Clay, the creation of humanity is never described as an act of profound spiritual love. It is not a poetic narrative of a universe seeking to understand itself. It is instead a matter of pure utility. It is an administrative solution to an infrastructural problem. The texts are remarkably blunt about the motivation behind this biological engineering. Before the creation of the human prototype, the records tell us that the gods themselves had to bear the burden of physical labor. They were the ones digging the vast networks of canals. They were the ones dredging the heavy, wet silt from the Euphrates River. They were the ones mining the earth and maintaining the architecture of a civilization that required constant, grueling upkeep. The Sumerian texts describe this labor as a crushing, relentless toll. For 40 periods, the records say, the lesser gods suffered the work. They excavated the watercourses. They piled up the mountains of excavated dirt. Until, finally, the breaking point was reached. The workers rebelled. They burned their tools in the fire. They marched upon the dwelling of the chief administrator, and they refused to continue the work. This is the recorded catalyst for the creation of mankind. Not a burst of divine inspiration, but a desperate need to replace a striking workforce. Humanity was engineered to be a biological machine. We were designed, quite literally, to take the yoke from the shoulders of our predecessors. This explains the clinical trial and error of the biological vessel assembly. A replacement worker must possess a very specific set of traits. They need the manual dexterity to hold a plough and swing a pickaxe. They need the physical stamina to stand under the harsh Mesopotamian sun for hours on end. And they need the cognitive capacity to understand complex commands, measure grain, and follow architectural blueprints. But crucially, they must be docile enough to accept their labour without question. They must be intelligent enough to work, but not so advanced that they challenge the hierarchy. It is a profoundly melancholic view of human origins. It frames our entire species as a manufactured labour force, constructed to maintain an agricultural and industrial complex that we did not invent. As you lie there, listening to the echoes of these ancient texts, I invite you to pause and reflect. If this journey into the deep past is helping you unwind, please consider leaving a soft like on this video, or subscribing to our Midnight Archive. Your engagement helps us continue to unearth these forgotten histories. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know how this perspective on human origins shapes your view of the ancient world. Let us return to the rhythm of the clay. Once the human prototype was stabilized, the burden of the earth was officially transferred. The Sumerian texts describe the moment humanity was given its purpose. They were handed the pickaxe and the earth basket. They were instructed in the exact sciences of irrigation, harvesting, and brick-making. The records state that the gods rejoiced, for they were finally free from the crushing weight of physical toil. Humanity took up the tools, bowed its head, and the steady, rhythmic drumbeat of civilization resumed. Day after day, year after year, a localized workforce bound to the soil. When a Sumerian labourer dug a trench, or harvested a field of barley, or stacked mud bricks into the shape of a ziggurat, they did not believe they were building human civilization. They believed, with absolute certainty, that they were maintaining the estate of their creators. If we read this not as primitive poetry, but as a literal, procedural memory of our origins, it shatters the orthodox narrative. We are no longer the proud, slow-stumbling pioneers pulling ourselves up from the dirt. We are the manufactured custodians of a pre-existing world. We were built to serve a specific physical function, and this realization leads us directly to a glaring physical truth. A workforce implies a master. An agricultural yield implies a consumer. A maintained city implies an inhabitant. Who are they working for? If the newly engineered biological machine was handed the pickaxe and the earth basket, we must inevitably ask who handed it to them. We have spent so much time staring down into the mud, examining the clay vessels built to bear the burden of labour. But to understand the true architecture of this ancient world, we must turn our gaze upward. We must look at the masters. In Orthodox history, we are taught a very specific way to read ancient pantheons. We are instructed to see them as poetry. We view them as personifications of the wind, the rain, the harvest, or the shifting seasons. We wrap them in glowing auras, place them on metaphorical clouds, and dismiss them as the superstitions of a primitive people trying to make sense of a chaotic universe. But the Sumerians did not write about abstract concepts. They wrote about a physical, tangible presence. They called them the Anunnaki. And to understand what the cuneiform tablets are actually recording, we must perform a radical act of historical reading. We must deliberately strip away their godhood. We must peel back the thousands of years of religious interpretation that have coated these figures in divine gold. Take away the halos, take away the thunderbolts, take away the omnipotence and the omniscience. What remains when the myth is scraped down to the bare clay? When you read the texts without the lens of modern mythology, you do not find ethereal spirits hovering above the Mesopotamian basin. You find flesh and blood. You find an administrative class. You find beings who walk the earth, who require shelter, and who enforce a strict, almost clinical hierarchy. The Anunnaki of the earliest records are strikingly uncomfortably grounded. They are not magical beings conjuring cities out of thin air. They rely on technology, not miracles. They calculate the stars. They measure the land. They argue over resources, mining quotas, and the division of labour. They built massive physical structures. We call them temples today, but in the Sumerian reality, these were administrative headquarters, granaries, and operational centres. They were the fortified estates of the ruling class. We use the word God to describe them, but that is our translation, burdened by centuries of later theology. The Sumerian symbol that often precedes their names is the dingir. It is a star-shaped logogram. It simply meant a being of the high sky, or a supreme authority. It denoted a distinction in origin and rank, not necessarily a supernatural immortal entity. What if we choose to take the texts at their exact word? What if the Anunnaki were simply an advanced physical people, beings of flesh, bone, and profound intellect who possessed the surviving sciences of the pre-flood world? They were the genetic engineers working in the house of the breath of clay. They were the entire reason for the creation of the human prototype was their refusal to continue the back-breaking work of excavating the riverbeds and maintaining the agricultural grids. They required sustenance. They required the physical labour of agriculture to maintain their outposts. They were bound by the very real, very heavy physics of the world they were trying to master. When you peel away the glowing layers of later religious devotion, sentence by sentence, tablet by tablet, you do not find limitless power. You find weariness. You find a rigid, highly structured organisation struggling under the weight of an immense global task. You find masters who are desperate enough to engineer a workforce because they themselves could no longer bear the physical toll of reconstruction. Beneath the divine aura, you find the deep, lingering exhaustion of survival. Listen to the complaints recorded in the clay. The gods are tired. We are deeply conditioned by modern theology to imagine the divine as boundless. We picture beings of pure energy and light, entities that speak galaxies into existence without breaking a sweat, existing entirely outside the harsh laws of physics and biology. But that is not what the Sumerians wrote. Read the surviving texts, specifically the great epics that detail the era before humanity. The Anunnaki, those beings who descended to manage the earth, are profoundly, physically exhausted. They are covered in the thick, heavy mud of the Mesopotamian basin. They are holding the pickaxe and the earth basket. They are digging the canals. The rivers of this ruined world need dredging. The erratic, violent waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates must be tamed if agriculture is to survive. The infrastructure of a shattered planet must be rebuilt from scratch. And the burden of this back-breaking manual labour falls entirely on the lesser gods. For 40 periods, 40 long, grinding measures of time, they suffer the work. The clay tablets do not describe glorious celestial beings floating effortlessly above the soil. They describe labourers complaining about the dirt, the blistering heat, and the endless crushing weight of their shifts. The texts record their weeping. They record their bitter grievances. The exhaustion of the gods is written into the foundational bedrock of human history. Eventually, the breaking point arrives. The rebellion of the lesser gods, a concept we touched on earlier, is not some cosmic war of angels in the heavens. It is a labour strike, a literal, historical mutiny of desperate, overworked engineers. The ancient records tell us that in the middle of the night, the workers finally drop their tools. They set fire to their spades. They burn their earth baskets in the darkness. They march en masse upon the house of their chief administrator, demanding an end to the heavy labour. The commanders are terrified. They are awakened in the dark by a violent mob of their own people. The system is collapsing. The agricultural project is failing. They desperately need a workforce, or their fragile colony will simply starve to death in the mud. Step back for a moment and look at this scene. Look at the mundane, gritty, desperate reality of it. This is not the behaviour of omnipotent creators. This is the behaviour of flawed, vulnerable managers trying to hold together a failing restoration project. As you lie there in the quiet of the night, think of the heavy weariness recorded in those ancient syllables. Let your own exhaustion meet theirs across the millennia. If these late-night reflections bring you a sense of peace, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a gentle like, or share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us build a quiet archive of our own. Now return to the firelight of that ancient strike. The Anunnaki need food to eat. They need water to drink. They need sleep to recover from their labour. They bleed, they argue, and they panic when their authority is challenged. When we strip away the golden halo of later religious interpretation, what remains in the Sumerian text is startlingly clinical. The Dingir were not magical spirits. They were flesh and blood. This labour crisis is the exact moment that forces the creation of humanity. The biological vessel assembly we discussed earlier, the drafting of the human worker, was not an act of divine love. It was an act of administrative triage. It was an emergency measure to prevent a total collapse of their society. They needed a biological machine that could hold the pickaxe, so they built one out of the clay. They were a people stranded on the wrong side of the cataclysm. They were tasked with reconstructing the glory of the drowned parent culture, but they lacked the automated infrastructure of the old world. They were reduced to digging in the mud, trying to remember the mathematics of the stars while their hands blistered from the soil. The myth of the gods begins to look like the history of a shipwrecked crew. A highly advanced people forced to start over with primitive tools, passing down their shattered knowledge to the biological machines they engineered to do their heavy lifting. Realize that omnipotent beings do not get tired. Only survivors do. Look at the offerings brought to the early temples. Not spiritual energy, not ethereal devotion, but grain and meat, beer and bread, roast mutton and dates. The Anunnaki, as recorded in the Cuneiform archives, were not abstract cosmic entities dwelling in a formless void. They did not sustain themselves on the prayers or the faith of their followers. They were physical, biological beings, and because they were physical, they were bound by the most fundamental law of biology. They had to eat. When we strip away the layers of modern theological bias and read the Sumerian records literally, a startlingly grounded reality emerges. The gods were hungry. They were tired. The texts explicitly detail a time before humanity existed, a time when the lesser gods were forced to perform the grueling, back-breaking labour of terraforming the Mesopotamian basin. They dug the rivers, they cleared the mud, they maintained the irrigation canals. The ancient records do not describe a magical, effortless shaping of the earth. They describe the physical exhaustion of the gods. They mention their pickaxes. They mention their earth baskets. They record their sweat, their complaints, and their eventual labour strike. They burned their tools in the night and surrounded the house of their chief administrator. This was not a spiritual crisis. It was a mutiny over physical exhaustion. To truly understand the flesh and blood reality of these beings, we must look at the function of the early cities. Orthodox history views the massive ziggurats as primitive religious monuments, but the physical evidence and the texts themselves tell a different story. These structures were not just temples. They were administrative headquarters, distribution centres, and heavily guarded granaries. The daily rituals performed by the priests were not abstract ceremonies. They were literal catering services. The surviving records detail the exact meals prepared for the gods. 2 meals a day, morning and evening, laid out on physical tables behind closed doors. The texts specify the precise cuts of meat required, the exact volume of high-quality beer, the specific types of flour to be milled. This level of obsessive, mundane detail is not the language of spiritual metaphor. It is the language of a logistic supply chain designed to sustain a physical elite. As you rest tonight, listening to the slow unspooling of deep time, consider the profound implications of this reality. If you are finding comfort and curiosity in this midnight archive, I invite you to gently like this video, leave a quiet comment about your own thoughts, and subscribe to our journey. Your peaceful engagement helps keep this archive open for all who wander the night. Let us return to the physical limitations recorded in the clay. The Anunnaki required sleep. They had dedicated, restricted living quarters atop the ziggurats, where no human was allowed to enter. They could fall ill. They aged, albeit on a timescale vastly different from our own. They fought bitter territorial wars over agricultural yields and mining resources. They were entirely dependent on the physical environment they were trying to tame. The engineering of humanity was not a grand act of cosmic love or spiritual expansion. It was a pragmatic solution to a biological crisis. The gods were starving, their workforce had mutinied, and they desperately needed a self-replicating biological machine to manage the fields and harvest the crops. We were built to hold the plough. When you remove the mythological gloss added by later civilizations, the divine aura fades away entirely. What remains is an image that is both deeply recognizable and profoundly unsettling. We are not looking at the omnipotent architects of the universe. We are looking at a desperate, high-tech survivor colony, stranded in the mud of a ruined world, trying to rebuild the infrastructure they needed simply to survive. When you step back from the fragmented pieces of the ancient world, a different kind of picture begins to form. We have spent tonight walking through the dark corridors of Orthodox history, picking up the heavy, anomalous stones that standard timelines prefer to leave behind. We trace the sudden, unexplainable arrival of Uruk and its mature infrastructure. We looked at the sterile clay layer discovered by Leonard Woolley, 2.5 meters of silent water-laid silt that physically severed the past from the present. We listened to the ghost tongue of the Sumerian linguistic isolate, a language with no mother and no sister tongues, echoing in a vacuum. We examined the inherited perfection of base 60 mathematics, a geometry that skipped the slow rehearsal of trial and error entirely. And finally, we read the clinical procedural records of biological engineering, where flesh and blood administrators known as the Anunnaki desperately sought a workforce to alleviate their own exhaustion. For centuries, we have treated these anomalies as isolated curiosities, a geological fluke here, a mathematical mystery there, a poetic myth to explain the rest. But what if we tie these threads together? This is where the narrative shifts from a collection of strange artifacts into a unified survivor theory. If you look closely, these are not separate, unrelated mysteries. They are the intersecting footprints of a single catastrophic event. They are the coherent, logical survival strategy of a shipwrecked crew. The pieces fit together with a chilling, perfect elegance. The geological reality of the flood explains the linguistic isolate. The linguistic isolate explains the suddenness of the writing. The suddenness of the writing preserves the base 60 mathematics, and the mathematics governed the ziggurats, which fed the flesh and blood gods who engineered the biological machines they needed to survive. Imagine the reality of the Mesopotamian basin as the waters finally receded. The world as they knew it was gone. The infrastructure of their highly advanced pre-flood age was buried under millions of tons of mud. The Anunnaki were not arriving in this valley to build a new world from scratch. They were a remnant population, desperately trying to salvage the mathematical, architectural, and agricultural systems of an epoch that had just drowned. The suddenness of Sumerian civilization is no longer a mystery when viewed through this lens. They did not invent the wheel, the calendar, or the complex social order. They unpacked them. The base 60 mathematics was not developed in the mud of the Euphrates River. It was remembered. The unique, isolated language was not a spontaneous invention. It was the native tongue of the survivors, preserved in a vacuum because everyone else who spoke its parent languages had perished in the deep. As you lie there, drifting in the quiet of the night, take a moment to weigh this possibility. If these nocturnal journeys into the deep past bring you peace, consider leaving a like and gently subscribing to our Midnight Archive. Let me know in the comments how it feels to look at human history not as a slow, clumsy climb out of the dark, but as a brilliant, frantic rescue mission. This unified theory forces an absolute inversion of the human story. We have always cast ourselves as the pioneers of civilization, the proud inventors who figured out how to plant wheat, stack stones, and chart the stars. But the clay tablets tell a different, far more humbling story. We were not the architects of the first civilization. We were its biological machinery. We were engineered in the twilight of a dying age, born into the mud to carry the earth baskets and dig the canals for a race that was already ancient before our first breath. We are not the dawn, we are the inheritors of the dusk. I want to ask you to do something difficult. As you rest here, listening in the quiet of the night, I want you to let go of the linear timeline you were taught in school. The neat, comforting chart on the classroom wall. The one that begins with primitive humans discovering fire, slowly inventing the wheel, tentatively stacking stones, and marching steadily, predictably, upward toward the present day. We are taught that history is a slow climb out of the dark. We are taught that every milestone of civilization was a fresh discovery, forged through centuries of clumsy trial and error. But something about that explanation remains incomplete. When we look closely at the Sumerian anomaly, that steady upward march simply shatters. Think of the fragments we have gathered together tonight in our Midnight Archive. The 2.5 meters of water-laid silt that Leonard Woolley found at Uruk. The linguistic isolate of a ghost tongue with no known ancestors. The base 60 mathematics that appeared suddenly, perfectly calibrated to the precession of the equinoxes. And the tired flesh and blood administrators who required human hands to dig their canals, harvest their grain, and rebuild their shattered infrastructure. What if all of this points to a completely different reality of who we are? A profound inversion of the human story. For generations, we have cast ourselves as the original architects of society, the brilliant, scrappy creators of mathematics, agriculture, law, and urban planning. But the clay tablets from the Mesopotamian basin do not claim that. They never have. They tell us that humanity was handed the tools to maintain a system we did not design. We were given the pickaxe and the earth basket. We are not the pioneers, but the inheritors. We are the inheritors of a salvaged world. And this realization should not diminish humanity's worth. It does not make our history smaller or our achievements less significant. In fact, it makes our survival incredibly noble. To be a custodian of the dusk is an impossibly heavy burden. Imagine the sheer resilience required to wake up in the deep mud of a post-cataclysmic world. The great parent culture is drowned. The floodwaters have finally receded, leaving behind only water-laid silt and ruined foundations. The original architects are exhausted, their numbers dwindling, their era coming to a close, and humanity is left standing in the damp earth holding the blueprint. We did not slowly invent civilization out of nothing. We were handed a flickering torch by hands that could no longer carry it. And against all odds, through floods and famines and the slow grind of time, we kept it burning. We guarded the sacred geometry. We maintained the sexagesimal system, dutifully measuring out the 60 seconds of the minute and the 360 degrees of the circle, long after the astronomical reasons for those measurements were washed away by the rain. We shifted our identity from engineered labourers to the sole custodians of Earth. We became the preservers of the harvest. We took the inherited sciences, the bronze alloys, the medical tablets, and we built a new epoch on top of the sterile clay layer. We did not stumble blindly in the dark until we found the light. We woke up in the ruins of a golden age and chose to rebuild it, brick by mud brick. As you drift tonight, letting go of the day, I invite you to look at the modern world around you through this new lens. Think of the digital clocks glowing quietly in the dark of your room. Think of the structural physics holding up the buildings outside your window, the precise global coordination of our modern supply chains. We look at these marvels and we see the ultimate pinnacle of human invention. We see our own modern genius. But what if we are just looking at a highly polished reflection of an ancient inheritance? What if our towering, illuminated metropolis is simply the latest iteration of Eridu, the latest attempt by the inheritors to fulfill a contract signed in wet clay thousands of years ago? A contract that asked us simply to remember what was before and to keep the great wheel turning. If history is not a straight line, but a circle, then everything we have explored tonight demands a profound shift in how we view our place in the cosmos. We have been taught to see time as an arrow, a steady, comforting trajectory moving from primitive darkness into the brilliant light of the modern age. We start in the dust, we invent the wheel, we build the city, we reach the stars. It is a narrative of endless, uninterrupted upward momentum. But the clay beneath Mesopotamia remembers a different rhythm. The sterile clay layer is not simply a geological curiosity. It is the physical boundary of a great rotation. It tells us that the wheel of time turns, and when it completes its circuit, the slate is wiped clean. We build, we forget. The waters rise, the waters recede. We build again. The wheel turns, the cities rise. The flood sweeps over. The clay settles. Think about the inherited sciences we have uncovered. The base 60 mathematics, the precision of the celestial tracking, the complete, fully formed grammar of a linguistic isolate. These are not the first clumsy steps of a new species. They are the salvaged fragments of a previous cycle. We are not the pioneers of civilization. We are the inheritors of the dusk. We are the descendants of the survivors, tasked with carrying the earth basket long after the original architects have faded into the shadows. As you lie there, suspended in the quiet hours of the night, allow yourself to feel the weight of this turning wheel, the slow, rhythmic breathing of the earth itself. If this journey into the deep past has brought you a sense of wonder, I invite you to gently like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to our Midnight Archive. Your quiet presence here helps us keep the embers of these ancient mysteries alive. Let us drift deeper into the realization of the circle. What if the towering achievements of our current age are not the absolute pinnacle of human evolution? What if they are merely the latest iteration of a pattern that has played out a dozen times before? There is no need for fear in this thought. There is only a profound, humbling peace, the realization that we are part of something unimaginably vast, a cycle of birth, destruction, preservation, and rebirth. The The Sumerians understood this deeply. It is why their texts are obsessed with the restoration of what was before. They did not suffer from the modern illusion of permanent progress. They knew the waters could return. They knew the sky could change. The great year continues its slow rotation through the heavens. The procession of the equinoxes ticks onward, oblivious to the fragile empires we construct in the mud. The wheel turns, the stars shift, the ice melts, the rivers overflow. We build, we forget, we wash away, we build again. The flesh and blood gods, those exhausted teachers who dragged humanity through the bottleneck of extinction, eventually surrendered to the heavy pull of time. Their names dissolved into abstract mythology. Their physical presence faded, leaving behind only the cold stone of the ziggurats and the silent, encoded geometry of the heavens. Humanity was left alone in the cradle of the Mesopotamian basin. We held the tools, we spoke the orphaned language, and as the millennia passed, we slowly forgot where those gifts came from. We convinced ourselves that we had invented the pickaxe. We convinced ourselves that we had authored the math. We mistook the salvage operation for the dawn of creation. But the truth remains locked in the earth, waiting patiently for anyone willing to read the dirt. It waits in the water-laid silt. It waits in the anomalies of the ancient script. As the night deepens, let go of the need for an endless linear tomorrow. Embrace the comforting rhythm of the great wheel. Allow your mind to detach from the urgency of the present moment and watch the ancient world slowly turn to dust once more. Time is the great solvent. It dissolves everything, even the memory of those who survived the deluge. Watch the generations pass, one slow, quiet turn of the great wheel after another. The original teachers, the flesh and blood administrators we've come to know as the Anunnaki, slowly began to fade from the physical world, slipping quietly into the realm of legend. Where did they go? The clay tablets offer no definitive map of their departure. The texts grow quiet, leaving us only with the silent winds of the desert. Perhaps their extended lifespans finally gave way to the deep, inevitable exhaustion of the earth. Perhaps they retreated, stepping back into the shadows of history to let their engineered inheritors take control of the cities. Or perhaps they simply died out, the last wandering ghosts of a drowned world, their bloodlines thinning until they were entirely absorbed by the human population. We do not know. And in the quiet space of that unknown, history began its slow, beautiful transformation into myth. Watch how reality blurs. Watch how the sharp, heavy edges of truth soften into the gentle curves of storytelling. For the first generation of humans walking the newly raised streets of Uruk, the administrators were not abstract concepts. They were rulers. They were seen, spoken to, and served. They required grain for their tables. They required labour for their canals. They were as real and as physically present as the waters of the Euphrates River. But time moves like the shifting dunes. For the third generation, these original builders became revered elders, their deeds already taking on the glow of exaggeration. By the 10th generation, they were ancestors of profound, almost terrifying power. And by the 50th generation, separated by thousands of years of oral tradition, the inevitable distortion of memory had done its heavy work. The physical teachers had become something entirely different. They had become gods. If you are finding peace in these quiet corridors of deep time, if the gentle unravelling of the past is helping you drift into a state of calm reflection, I warmly invite you to subscribe to the channel. Leave a like or share a quiet comment below about how quickly you think history becomes a myth. Your engagement helps keep this late-night archive open, allowing us to wander together through the echoes of antiquity. Now, let us return to the fading light of Mesopotamia. Think about how a physical reality transforms into a religion. The towering ziggurats, which began as practical administrative centres and literal storehouses for grain, slowly evolved in the human mind. Their original utilitarian purpose was forgotten. The storehouse became a sacred temple. The logistical, physical delivery of food to a hungry administrator became a ritualized sacrifice to an invisible deity. The clinical, biological procedures recorded in the ancient texts lost their technical vocabulary. The careful, procedural assembly of a biological vessel in the Bit Shimti was no longer understood as a science. In the mouths of later poets and priests, genetic engineering became magic. A sterile laboratory became a cosmic womb. The historical truth was never deliberately erased. It was simply dressed in poetry, buried under layers of deep metaphor and locked away in the rigid, beautiful geometry of cuneiform. This is how the old world truly ended. Not with a second cataclysm of water, but with a slow, collective amnesia. The physical evidence remained scattered across the landscape. The base 60 mathematics still perfectly tracked the precession of the equinoxes. The ghost tongue of the linguistic isolate still structured their thoughts. But the context was gone. Humanity had forgotten that it was an orphaned species living in the ruins of a greater age. We looked at the massive walls, the complex canals, and the standardized weights, and we simply assumed we had invented them all from scratch. The epic cosmic scope of the pre-flood world dissolved into the dust. The great administration vanished into the dark, and what was left behind, just us. Just the inheritors of the dusk, walking the sun-baked streets, trying to make sense of a world we were built to maintain but not to fully understand. Let us bring this vast, sweeping timeline back down to the earth. Let the sky fade and let the centuries collapse. We must return to the human scale, back to the very mud from which this mystery was born. Let us step back now from the dizzying heights of the ancient heavens. Leave behind the echoes of the Anunnaki, the roar of the great floodwaters, and the crushing, inevitable weight of the great wheel of time. Let the visions of drowned continents and cyclical histories fade gently into the shadows. Let us step back into the quiet midnight archive. The air in this room is still. It smells faintly of old paper, of dry dust, and of preserved silence. The world outside these walls is asleep. The frantic, linear rush of modern life has been suspended, leaving only you and me and the deep, abiding quiet of the past. As you listen, perhaps you're resting in the dark, lingering on the very edge of sleep, letting the mysteries of deep time wash over you like a slow, retreating tide. If this journey through the shadowed corridors of history has brought you a sense of wonder, or simply a moment of peace in the dark, please consider leaving a gentle like on this video. Subscribe to our channel to join us on future Midnight Wanderings, and if you find yourself awake, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where your mind wanders when you think of the distant days. Your quiet presence here in this digital archive is deeply appreciated. Now let us return our focus to the table in front of us. Resting there in its protective foam padding, illuminated by a single warm pool of light, is the physical artifact, the clay tablet. It is exactly where we left it at the beginning of our journey. It is small, unassuming. To the untrained eye, it does not look like a profound manual for the rebirth of a shattered world, nor does it look like the desperate salvage operation of a dying epoch. It simply looks like a fragment of dried mud, baked by a Mesopotamian sun over 5,000 years ago. Imagine reaching out in the dim light. Imagine picking it up again. Feel the density of it resting in the palm of your hand. It is heavier than it appears, a dense concentration of earth and memory. The edges are rough against your skin, worn down by the slow, grinding friction of millennia. Yet, the cuneiform wedges pressed into its surface remain incredibly sharp. You can trace them lightly with your fingertips. They are deliberate. They are precise. They are the calculated geometry of a people trying desperately to anchor their inherited reality against the eroding tides of time. But it is not the wedge-shaped text that draws our attention now. It is the small, smooth indentation on the lower left edge, the thumbprint. When we first began this exploration, this thumbprint was merely a curiosity, a fleeting, poetic reminder of a human presence. But now, after traversing the 2.5 meters of sterile clay layer at after reading the procedural, clinical notes of biological assembly, and after standing in the towering shadows of the ziggurats, this simple impression in the clay takes on a profound, almost overwhelming gravity. All the vast, sweeping currents of deep time compressed down into this single, solitary mark, the mathematical perfection of the base 60 clock, the haunting isolation of a ghost tongue with no known parent, the slow, tragic fading of flesh and blood survivors into abstract, unapproachable gods. All of these massive cosmic concepts suddenly collapse into the physical reality of a single human hand. Someone sat by the banks of the Euphrates River in the distant past. They scooped up a handful of wet, dark silt. They rolled it between their palms. They shaped it. And as they pressed their stylus into the damp earth, recording the fragile inheritance of a drowned world, they inadvertently left a piece of themselves behind. They left a physical, biological signature, caught forever in the very medium they used to preserve their civilization. It is no longer just an artifact. It is a mirror. It is a bridge spanning the abyss of thousands of years, connecting the warmth of your hand to the warmth of theirs. Look closely at the thumbprint one last time. Notice the microscopic ridges, the unique whorls and lines of a life long extinguished, yet perfectly frozen in the baked earth. What did that ancient scribe feel, I wonder, as the wet earth began to dry beneath their hands? Picture them for a moment, sitting in the cooling shadows of a ziggurat courtyard, the Mesopotamian sun dipping below the horizon. They have just pressed the final wedge into the damp surface of the tablet. They leave their thumbprint there, right at the edge, perhaps by accident, or perhaps as a quiet, desperate assertion of their own existence. In that fleeting moment, as the moisture evaporates and the clay begins its slow transformation into stone, what thoughts crossed their mind? Did they understand the weight of the burden they were carrying? Did they look up at the darkening sky and wonder if the architects of their world were ever coming back? Or did they simply feel the deep, quiet exhaustion of a long day, much like the exhaustion you might be feeling right now, as the modern world falls quiet outside your window? The clay tablet is not merely an administrative record or a mythological poem. It is a message in a bottle, cast into the deepest, darkest ocean imaginable, the ocean of time. The Sumerians understood that everything they knew, everything they had salvaged from the drowned world before, was incredibly fragile. They were standing on the edge of a vast, encroaching amnesia. And so they wrote. They etched their mathematics, their star charts, their memories of the flood, and the names of their strange, tired gods into the only material they knew could survive a cataclysm, the very earth itself. They baked their memories into the mud, hoping that someone, someday, on some distant, unimaginable shore, would pick it up and understand. When we hold that tablet today, when we trace the ridges of that 4,000-year-old fingerprint, the ocean of time momentarily evaporates. We are no longer separated by millennia. We are simply two human beings, sitting in the quiet dark, sharing a memory of a world that refused to be entirely forgotten. It is a profound, almost overwhelming connection. As you lie there, listening to these echoes from the ancient dust, I invite you to become a custodian of this memory too. If this journey into deep time has brought you peace, if it has given your mind a place to rest, consider leaving a gentle like or subscribing to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below whenever you wake. Your presence here, tonight, is the proof that the ancient scribe's message finally reached the shore. The gods of Eden, the Anunnaki, the towering ziggurats, and the great flood, they have all retreated into the mist. They have become the stories we tell ourselves when the night is long and the shadows grow deep. But the clay remains. The dust settles over the ruins of Uruk, just as sleep is beginning to settle over you. History is not a straight, unbroken road. It is a great turning wheel, moving through ages of brilliant light and epochs of quiet, restorative darkness. We are just passengers on that wheel, inheriting the dusk, waiting for the dawn. So let go of the need to solve every mystery. Let go of the rigid timelines and the heavy certainties of the waking world. Allow the deep, rhythmic breathing of the past to synchronize with your own. The ancient scribes have finished their work. The tablets are safely stored in the Midnight Archive. There is nothing left to decipher tonight. Just the gentle, steady turning of the earth, carrying us all through the dark. Close your eyes. Let the image of that small, hardened piece of clay and the fingerprint resting softly upon its surface slowly fade into the darkness of your room. Drift away now into the quiet ancient night. The hour is growing very late. The air in the room has grown still. The dust of Uruk and the dry winds of Eridu have settled once again into the earth. As you lie there in the dark, listening to the quiet cadence of the night, let the immense weight of these thousands of years begin to drift away. You have travelled a very long distance tonight. You have walked from the modern edge of the Persian Gulf, down through the sterile clay layer, and all the way back to the distant days. But now the journey is done. The thumbprint in the clay remains behind the glass. It is a silent, patient witness to a story that no longer needs to be solved before morning. It is simply a memory. And memories, like the slow tides of the ocean of time, will wait for you. Think of the great wheel of time. It turns slowly, so slowly that we cannot even feel its motion in our waking hours. The grand empires rise up from the mud, and they fall back into it. The mighty rivers change their course. The floodwaters sweep over the land, erasing the slate, and then they recede, leaving behind a fresh, quiet canvas of virgin soil. There is a strange, profound comfort in this cycle. It means that nothing is ever truly lost. It is only resting, just as you are resting now. The ancient Sumerian scribes who pressed their hands into the wet mud knew that the night was meant for absolute stillness. Even the gods themselves, those weary architects of our world, grew tired. They laid down their heavy tools, they sought the quiet of the dark, and so must you. Take a slow, deep breath in. Feel the quiet architecture of the night assembling itself around you. Let the breath out, slowly and completely. The air you breathe is the same air that once blew across the high, silent tops of the ziggurats. It is the same cool wind that swept through the empty bronze workshops of Uruk after the fires died down. We share this atmosphere with the phantoms of the past. We share the same sky and the same turning stars, but they do not ask anything of us tonight. The ghosts of Mesopotamia do not demand our labour. They only ask to be remembered. And we have remembered them. We have held their ancient words in our minds. We have honoured the profound silence that follows their story. If you have found comfort within this midnight archive, if the distant echoes of deep time have helped you unburden your mind and find a sense of peace, I invite you to leave a gentle mark of your own, a quiet like on this video, a whispered comment in the dark beneath it. Let it be your personal thumbprint in the digital clay, a small, enduring sign that you are here, walking the ruined, starlit walls of history with me. And if you wish to wander these ancient corridors again, I invite you to subscribe. Join us in this quiet space. The archive is always open to those who seek the calm of the past. We will have many more nights like this, many more forgotten mysteries to uncover when the rest of the world goes to sleep. But for now, the cuneiform tablets are returned to their velvet beds. The heavy glass cases are locked. The lights of the gallery are dimming one by one. The rigid timeline of Orthodox history and the beautiful, haunting anomalies that break it both fade away into the shadows. You do not need to carry the survivor's burden tonight. The historical triage is over. The custodian of the dusk is turning the iron key in the lock, securing the past so that you might have peace in the present. Let your mind drift. Let the slow, ancient rivers of the Mesopotamian basin carry you downward into the quiet, dark, healing waters of sleep. The great year is ending. The long cycle is complete. A new world is only a dream away. Close your eyes. Let the silence take hold. Sleep well, wanderer. Sleep deeply and without fear. Until the next time we meet in the shadows of history, good night.